started. We'll do a little slow start as people start to come in. We're using Zoom this morning, and a couple of things regarding Zoom that I'm pretty sure everyone's familiar with. As you come in, you'll be, oh, I can't see. There we go. As an attendee of the webinar, you'll be muted and your video will be turned off. There's a chat button at the bottom of the screen. So please use the chat and select the host. If you're having any technical difficulties, let us know and our technical team can help you out. And certainly use the chat to introduce yourself and your affiliation. It's good to kind of know who's in the room, and we'll kind of see how that goes throughout the day. And if you have questions for our panelists, we're going to ask you to use the Q&A function so that we'll get those to the panelists throughout the day. And I think we're about ready to go. Let's see. Okay. Drew, are we recording just to make sure?
Yes, we are.
Okay, so we're good to go. All right, let's start the morning. Good morning and welcome to our second day of our fire symposium. Let's see. I think I might have, give me just a moment. I think I have a little. Drew, can you just confirm that the slide advanced?
Yes, it advanced.
Okay, great. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. Excuse me. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our second day of our Wildfire, Weather, Water, Weeds, and Wildlife Symposium. I'm Eileen Alderwenda, the Executive Director of the Council for Watershed Health. And around 25 years ago, Dorothy Green founded the Council for Watershed Health to advance the health and sustainability of our region's watersheds, rivers, and habitats, both in natural areas and in urban neighborhoods. We do this through three key strategies: science-based research, education, and inclusive stakeholder engagement. It's with this continued mission in mind that we've convened wildlife experts today, including you and our audience, and for this symposium. Our goal today is for all of us to share the state of the science, discuss lessons learned, and identify a resilient path forward. We've hosted many symposia over the years. This is our third symposium on wildfire. We're excited to start the day off with more than 200 people registered for today's session. And while we're happy that all of you are joining us today, we'd much rather be in person, where we can enjoy each other's company and network during the breaks. And speaking of breaks, we heard you loud and clear from day one and have scheduled a quick break after our first panel discussion. We have a lot packed in today, a lot packed into 4 hours. And many of our speakers have provided references and resources, and we'll post those on our symposium webpage. So please be sure to check that out if you haven't yet. And then mark your calendars and register for day 3 if you haven't. It's 2 weeks. It's on October 14th, and we'll be continuing the conversation that we'll have today. I'd like to just kind of reflect a little bit on day 1 for those of you that may not have had a chance to join us, or just a refresh for those of you that have. What we learned from day 1, we had Jessica Morris from the California Natural Resources Association agency join us. She provided an overview of wildfire and economic, social, and environmental issues and set the stage for our presenters. Several of our presenters shared weather and climate change research and the impacts and implication of smoke on our air quality. We heard from flood control experts on the soil and sediment challenges and strategies that result from wildfires. And we also heard about the negative impact on native vegetation and agriculture, and we'll be hearing more about this today. The poster sessions also provided many important perspectives from landscape architects and graduate students who are sure to be our next leaders in this field. And We want to thank our symposium sponsors. Today's symposium and each of our days is made possible by the generous support from our partners and sponsors, thanks to the LA County Department of Public Works, LA Department of Water and Power, Jacobs, Southern California Edison, and the Scotts Miracle-Gro Foundation. We've partnered and collaborated with many of our sponsors over the years, and their support reflects their commitment to improving the health of our watersheds. And with that, I'd like to introduce Steve Arakawa, the Council for Watershed Health Board President, who will share a welcome and introduce our panels. So,
thanks, Eileen. Yes, my name is Steve Arakawa, and I'm president of the Council for Watershed Health. And I'm very happy that we have you all here today. On behalf of the council board, it's my pleasure to welcome everybody to the symposium today. You know, several months ago, our board had a real engaging conversation about wildfire. Obviously, it's in our lives today, both in Northern California and Southern California, with all of the changes that are going on. And wildfire was one of the key topics that we identified. It's a topic that resonated with our board members, especially because of changing weather and climate and how that's affecting our lands, our water, our wildlife. We look forward to learning more about these effects from the speakers today. I think we have a really good group of people that are very knowledgeable and expert in their area. And you know, this allows us to gather information that we as an organization can integrate into our efforts, because our efforts are oriented towards the watersheds and to ensure that we have the health and resiliency of these watersheds and the communities in which we work. So going on to the program here on the next slide, today's event will focus on the interplay of fire and the various ecosystems of Southern California. And panel one, which is made up of experts that will discuss how plant communities in our shrublands and forests respond to wildfires, including the interplay with invasive species, invasive weeds, and the threats of biodiversity loss and vegetation type conversion. Panel two focuses on how habitats and wildlife interact with fire and how they can support recovery and what research is still needed. At noon, we will move quickly into our poster session, and for those that can stay around, I urge you to do so. Grab a quick lunch and join us for up to 6 5-minute poster presentations that we think will be engaging and enlightening. So with that, I would like to, as the council, provide this land acknowledgement. The Council for Watershed Health acknowledges that the land in our watersheds are unceded ancestral homelands of the Gabrieleño, Fernandeño, and Barbareño, Ventureño, and we gratefully acknowledge the native peoples on whose homelands we live and who we are the ancestral caretakers of the land, water, and life of our watersheds. We recognize that they are still present, and we honor their elders, both past and present, and the descendants. The council is undertaking several initiatives to listen, understand, and support the native peoples of our region, and we look forward to continuing this work in the months and years ahead. And today we're honored to introduce Mark Villasenor, current vice president of the Fernandeño Tataviam Band of Mission Indians, to provide us with a welcome. And with that, Mark, thank you very much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Oh, you're very welcome. Just like Mr. Arakawa was saying, my name is Mark Villasenor. I'm the tribal vice president for the Fernandeño Tataviam Band of Mission Indians. Our people are located within Los Angeles County, northern Los Angeles County. Our traditional boundaries are parts of Simi Valley and parts of Los Angeles, San Fernando Valley, Santa Clarita Valley, and Antelope Valleys. We are a coalition of 26 villages, all ranging throughout that area. And today I'm just going to offer a welcome song in our tradition. Whenever we're welcoming people into the areas as one of the 3 tribes of Los Angeles County, I'll sing this welcome song for you. The song is used to welcome people into villages, into gatherings, into events to start the day off. It's literally means Bako means enter, and then Kema means come. So this song means come enter, please come enter, come with us. And it's welcoming everybody in. Bako Kema, Bako Kema, Bako Kema, Menai Kema, Menai Kema, Bako Kema, Bako Kema, Bako Kema, Menai Kema, Menai Kema, Bako Kema, Bako Kema, Bako Kema, Menai Kema, Menai Kema, Bako Kema, Bako Kema, Bako Kema, Menai Kema, Menai Kema, Bako Kema, Bako Kema, Bako Kema, Menai Kema, Menai Kema, Bako Kema, Bako Kema, Bako Kema, Menai Kema, Menai Kema, And once again, I'd like to thank everyone for inviting me here today. And I hope today goes off well. And I hope you learn a lot and learn effective ways moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. That was very special. And thank you for providing that time. We really appreciate it. And that helps us understand the history of our lands here in which we live. So now we can get started with our panels. And I'd like to introduce our first moderator, say a little bit about that. If I can go to the next slide. So Drew Reedy, who is Council Senior Manager, who has led the production of this symposium, he, among the experts that he reached out to when we started to plan this was Sabrina Drill with the University of California Cooperative Extension. She's been a frequent and longtime collaborator for the council, and we're really pleased to have her involved in the effort today. Her depth of understanding on a broad range of geographic, ecological, and social issues related to wildfire and her extensive network of experts has helped us convene really diverse perspectives and expertise focused on weather, water, weeds, and wildlife. And so we really thank you, Sabrina, for joining us today. And would you like to share a few words and get us started with the first panel?
Yes, thank you so much, Steve. It's always a pleasure working with CWH. I was actually one of your first employees back when it was me and Dorothy and Heather in the office. And it's great to work with Drew, Elise, and Eileen and everyone. I would like to welcome everyone on behalf of the University of California and Division of Agriculture and Natural Resources. We're a statewide network of county and campus-based academics. And through our local offices, research and extension centers, and especially through our close connection with the UC Berkeley College of Natural Resources, we have a long history of working to understand the ecosystems of California, how they interact with fire, and how we can help communities steward our resources and live with wildfire. In the first session, actually, sorry, just before I introduce, I just would like to take a moment. It doesn't have to be a silent minute or anything, but just take a moment to share good thoughts in whatever form you want to with all of our fellow Californians who are being impacted by a wildfire right now. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. In the first session, as Steve said, we're going to be focusing on California's plant communities and how fire, habitat, and people interact. Can I have the next slide? Next slide, please.
Sabrina, what are you seeing? I'm sorry.
I am only seeing my moderator the image
Okay.
of me, and I was seeing all the slides up till then.
Yeah.
It may be because the very next slide was a backup slide. So if you could
All right.
show slide 12. Perfect. Thank you so much.
There we go.
Great. So I'm going to be introducing all of our panelists briefly right now. And then once we get going, I'll just kind of hand it off to them just so we can really get to the meat of everything today. So starting us off is going to be Hugh Safford. He's a regional ecologist with the U.S. Forest Service. And his research looks at how environmental changes impact forest fire. He's had a long career working in multiple different kinds of ecosystems in California. So really excited to hear from him today. Next, we're going to hear from Alex Syphard. She's a scientist with expertise in examining how vegetation and land use impact fire and chaparral systems. Can I have the next slide? After that, we're going to hear from Marti Witter. Marti is a senior fire ecologist with the National Park Service, and she really focuses her work on dealing with a lot of tricky issues, both within the Santa Monica Mountains and within the wildland urban interface, as the Park Service and Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area works to support functional habitat right up next to the city. After that, we'll hear from Rachel Wing. She's with the California Botanic Garden, and she has extensive field experience working to prevent and control invasive weeds in the San Gabriel Mountains and in Angeles National Forest. And wrapping it up for us today is going to be my colleague in UCANR, Chris McDonald. He's a restoration ecologist with a depth of experience looking at the impact and management of invasive wildland weeds and how they are impacted and how they impact changing fire regimes. So, Hugh, are you ready to take us away?
I'm ready, and I'm going to turn off my video though, because I always distract myself watching myself give presentations. So I'll see you in a little bit, but thank you. Yeah, I'm ready to go. Let's start. Okay, you can go ahead to the next slide right away. Thank you. So basically my job is to just provide you a little bit of context with respect to current fire trends in California, where they're going, and then other people will be able to refer back to this stuff. So I'm just going to start with kind of where we should start, and that is looking at annual burned area in California over the last 40 years. And you can see not an exactly inexorable rise, but a pretty strong rise over time with some hiccups in between since the 1980s. The straight line is a linear regression. You can see it's highly significant, and the dotted line represents 5-year running mean. And just to interpret a little bit on the graph for you, you'll note that there are some red colored points. Those represent the years in which more than 1 million acres burned. The first of those was in 1999, and now we've had 4 of the last 5 years burn over 1 million acres. So clearly things are changing in California. So let's go to the next. Just hit forward, please. There you go. So it's important that we put this all in context, however, because if you're only thinking about burned area and not necessarily fire effects, 2020, which last year was characterized by many people as sort of a fire Armageddon or an absolute catastrophe, and it was in a lot of ways, but it's the first time since we've been keeping records, and we've got about 120 some odd years of decent fire records in California. It's the first year in that entire period where we've come anywhere near the probable range of annual area burn in a typical year in California before your American settlement. So it's when every time I talk with people about trends, I always try to take them back to kind of what the baseline is. Okay, next slide, please. So another thing I think that's really important, this kind of came up fuzzy, but another thing really to note is that, until maybe the early to mid 2000s, Southern California was essentially the national poster child of large, uncontrollable fires burning across landscapes, killing people and burning homes. Well, that's changed a lot. And since 2010, all of the action is in Northern California. And so I've just got 2 regressions here, and it shows you that actually the annual area burned in SoCal hasn't changed significantly since the 1980s, whereas Northern California has seen nearly an exponential rise in the last 10 years. And of course, this graphic doesn't use 2021, nor did the last one I showed you. And so the next slide will get at some of the reasons behind that. Yeah, so this is a slide that gets, I think, overused by people, but it's from a study that I did with a postdoc of mine 7 or 8 years ago. And all we tried to do here was this, and in this case, we're looking at fire frequency. And we were just simply trying to compare fire frequencies in California over the last 100 years versus our best scientifically based estimates of what probable fire frequencies were in California ecosystems before the mass arrival of Euro-Americans, which would have been, after about 1850 or so. And so you'll note that in Northern California, and then you can hit forward, please, on the slides. There you go. Yeah, in Northern California, the colors are largely cool colors, blues and light greens and turquoise and stuff. And without spending too much time on explaining exactly what this is here, what this is saying is that these are what we call formally frequent fire forests, or I call them that, the F4 ecosystems, which are mostly in this map, yellow pine, mixed conifer, and some of it are mixed evergreen type. But there's oak woodland in this, in the general sense as well, over a lot of the state. Oh, and I should note, you'll note there are a lot of white areas in there, and that's just simply because this particular effort was based on ecological sections that had an important component of federal lands in them, especially Forest Service and National Park Service. That's why there's a big gap, for example, in the Bay Area and also in the desert. But these are systems in which fire was very frequent before the arrival of Euro-Americans en masse after 1850. These are forest types in which you were seeing fires, every 5 to 20 years on average across most acres. And this had gone on for millennia. And the forests had responded. They were very open. They were dominated by fire-tolerant species, et cetera. And what's happened there is that fire suppression effects have essentially removed fire as an ecological force. And that's resulted essentially in a jungle of fuels on a lot of this landscape, a lot of dead material, high densities of forests that are competing for water and being killed by beetles, directly by drought, or being killed by fire. And note that in Southern California, there are a couple of islands of this kind of habitat, those colors rather, that represents the San Gabriels, the San Bernardinos, and the San Jacintos. And that's because those are little sky islands of Sierra forests, and they've suffered a temperature. Okay, forward, please. Okay, and then you see that there's some warm colors in the graphic as well. And these are systems dominated by chaparral, interior and coastal sage scrub. It doesn't really include the desert mixed shrublands or sagebrush, which are out in the white areas in this case. But basically what this is exactly the reverse situation. These are systems in which our best scientific evidence suggests that fire really wasn't all that frequent historically in these systems, or even prehistorically. There's just very low lightning strike density along the California coast. And so almost all of the fire regime was driven by human ignitions, as it continues to be. And so what's happened in a lot of these places that with these warm colors is that you actually have enhanced ignitions. We have more fires than we probably had historically. All right, next graphic. Next slide. Okay, so then I've got a couple of breakdowns by a region again here. So this is the Sierra Nevada framework area, most of eastern and northeastern California. And now we're not looking at fire frequency here, but rather we're looking at the severity of fires, another component of the fire regime. And so this maps the amount of area in any given year since 1984 in which, how much of those fires burned at what we call stand replacing severity. And there's a picture of that in the upper right in the graphic. These are places with more than 90% basal area lost to the fire. And you can see until the early 2000s, it sort of wandered around there between 10 and 20,000 hectares a year. And now it's gone way up. And hit the forward, please. So again, here you have an estimate from, again, from the scientific literature, is probably about how much of that habitat was created in the average year in the Sierra Nevada. And you can see that in these days, we're looking at about 7 times more of this habitat being created than we probably saw in a typical year, even though overall there's much less fire. It gives you a good feeling for how severe all that is. Okay, next slide. So I just want to note that in the Southern California Sky Island Forest, you have the same issue. This is a great paper by Katie Nigro and Nicole Molinari that came out a couple years ago that showed as well that in the forests in Southern California, there's an increase in very severe fire and forest loss. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so I just want to note briefly that the fire trends are not just threatening ecological values and the fire regime rather changes, but human lives, health, infrastructure, and the economy. Almost 200 people have been killed by wildfires in California since 2015. We now know that particulate matter released by wildfire is more likely to require hospitalizations than other sources of particulate matter. And that recent estimates are that anywhere from 1,200 to 3,000 excess deaths were caused in California last year simply from smoking. Okay, next slide. So I'll finish up with a couple of graphics, a couple of tables rather. So these are the 10 most costly US wildfires to last year. This is the graph on the right has the numbers inflation adjusted. And this is just insured loss, right? So it's real tough to put a value on places that weren't insured. And in all of these fires, there were, especially the ones out in the boonies, there were plenty of homes that weren't insured. And so those aren't included in this value. It also doesn't include fire suppression costs. Note that all 10 of these fires occurred in California. That's saying something. I just wanted to note, I've highlighted in yellow the 3 fires in this group that are in Southern California. it's telling that when I generated tables like this 10 years ago, almost all of the fires were in Southern California, except for the Oakland fire. But you can see starting particularly in 2017, all of the actions in almost all the actions in Northern California. All right, next slide. And then this graphic is the 10 most destructive US wildfires to 2020. And this is looking at structures lost and deaths caused by the fire. Again, you'll see that only 3 of them are in Southern California. As I said, if you'd done this graph 10, 15 years ago, it would have been all in Southern California. But on the right, I just wanted to link to some of the talks that are going to come after me. And you'll see that chaparral is a really important component in a lot of these fires, whether they're in Southern California or not. And it underlines how important it is for us to understand the ecology of chaparral and interactions with human habitation. Okay, and then the next slide is my last one. So just as some final thoughts, from the forest ecology standpoint, there's a really massive need to reduce forest density and fuels all over low and middle elevation conifer forests. Our management toolbox is actually really small. It basically involves affecting vegetation succession through forest thinning and fuels reduction. It can be done mechanically, it can be done by hand, it can be done with prescribed fire, and it can be done with wildland fire managed through resource benefits. One of the big issues with actually carrying this work out mechanically or by hand is that the current California economy is really poorly aligned with forest product production or forest product use. There are very few sawmills left in the state. Biomass energy has been fading for a while, and there are very few alternative uses of forest biomass that are economically viable because there's no subsidy from the federal government, state government. Secondly, people shouldn't be building homes in chaparral and fire-prone forests without major mitigations. Typically, they're not doing these things. People need to take into account design, materials, and our fire, and when they design things, when they build things, and when they plant things. And then finally, this is, I think, a more recent concern. I mean, smoky skies are becoming a fact of life in a lot of California, and this is a huge human health issue. Fires aren't just killing people and injuring people, but there's a lot of exposure to atmospheric pollutants, and we're talking about thousands of people who are dying a year in California from the current fires. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hugh. One of the things that I should have mentioned, so I'll just take a minute to say it now, is that a lot of the agency and nonprofit related experts who you're going to hear from today have really close relationships with many of our UC campuses and with other universities in the state. Hugh and the whole Pacific Southwest Research Station with UC Davis, Marti, who you'll hear from later, with UCLA, and our next presenter, Dr. Syphard, with San Diego State. So I just wanted to mention that we're all kind of working together in a research and extension ecosystem here. So, Alex. Alex, are you ready to go?
I am. Can you hear
There
me?
you are. Yes, we can hear you now. Can't see you yet, but yeah.
Yes. Okay. So today, what I want to do is to provide some background and a broad overview of fire-driven vegetation type conversion in Southern California. And when I'm talking about type conversion, what I'm referring to here is the shift from woody shrublands, chaparral systems to an herbaceous invasive grass system. Next. Otto Leopold wrote in his Sand County Almanac, "One of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. Much of the damage inflicted on land is quite invisible to laymen." And this quote has always resonated with me, especially if I'm looking at a landscape like the one in the picture on the right, where others might see a beautiful open grassy meadow, and I instead see a degraded landscape that should look a lot more like the photo to the left, which of course is a continuous blanket of native chaparral shrublands. Next. Chaparral is the most extensive vegetation type in all of California. It supports much of the high biodiversity in the state. It provides a wide range of ecosystem services. And its natural fire regime, unlike forests, is one of high intensity crown fire. So it tends to top kill the vegetation, which then returns to its pre-fire composition. And as Hugh was just mentioning, it historically burned fairly infrequently, about every 25 to 65 years. Next. And not only is it the most extensive vegetation type, but in the last century, it's actually burned more extensively than any other vegetation type, Although, as Hugh was mentioning, in the last several years, conifer forests have been burning a lot more, as you can see in the chart on the left. But if you look at the chart on the right, cumulatively speaking, in total area burned, you can see from 2000 to 2018, most of that has happened in shrub systems. And that difference is even more pronounced if you consider the area burned in fires that resulted in at least one structure burned. So most of the structures burning are happening in shrubland systems. Next slide. And with the excess fire, as Hugh was just mentioning, there's a decrease in the intervals in between fires. And this is detrimental to chaparral. And the reason is because it has to do with their post-fire response strategies. The most sensitive species are obligate, followed by facultative cedars. And these species have a fire-cued seed bank, which responds to fire, and the seedlings can germinate from this bank. The problem, in fact, obligate cedars, by the way, they depend on this for their germination and to regenerate. But the problem is they need up to 20 years to be able to mature and reestablish the seed bank before a fire comes through again, because then it can wipe out the species and extirpate it at the site. Less vulnerable are obligate resprouting species because they can resprout from fire from stems or lignotubers, and they tend to mature earlier than the cedars do. But young sprouts and young cedars are all sensitive to stress and drought, and there may be interactions with fire. And all chaparral species tend to have short dispersal distances and low recruitment rates, even for obligate resprouters, which means that once chaparral is gone, it's hard for it to return. Next slide. So this brings us to the vegetation type conversion. The premise is that short intervals prevent the recovery of chaparral, and in place of it, widely dispersed grasslands can invade and colonize, and because they're so flammable for such a long part of the year, they can increase fire frequency and thereby create a positive reinforcing cycle called the grass fire cycle, though it usually happens in a human context, so we've reframed it as a human grass fire cycle in an upcoming paper. Now, vegetation type conversion has been documented in chaparral, but there have been a lot of questions about, well, how much is really happening and where and why? Next slide. So this has been the focus of research for my colleagues and I, and one of our most recent projects is we placed plots across the entire Southern California region, and in those plots, we compared historical air photos with contemporary air photos and quantified the amount of woody cover and herbaceous cover, and then documented the change and the conversion from shrubland to grassland. And we found the change is actually quite extensive. You can see that in the map on the left, looking at the orange and red types of plots. But the rate of change and the proportion of change varies depending on the region within Southern California. So the South Coast has experienced the greatest proportion of woody decline and conversion, whereas the North Coast has experienced the least. Next slide. When looking at the reasons or the variables that best explain this decline and conversion, we found the ranking varies somewhat between regions, and it varies somewhat between the model method we used, but consistently short interval fire tends to be at the top, followed by soil moisture variables such as drought. And the other thing I want to notice that has come from our research is that type conversion is not just a one short interval event. It's something that tends to happen gradually over time. So this is hypothetical, but there can be multiple short interval fire events. There can be a time where there's an extended drought, which results in seedling mortality. Sometimes chaparral will convert to sage scrub before it converts to grass, because sage scrub is a little more resilient to high fire frequency. Next slide. And sensitivity can vary by species composition, even within the same functional type. So we're looking at this by actually going out and looking at seedlings and post-fire recovery at different intervals across California. Next slide. So finally, the thing I want to also mention is that there is a concern right now, because in the map on the left, you can see Southern California is very young. there's been a whole lot of fire covering the region that is less than 20 years old, in many areas that are less than 10 or 5 years old. So those areas are susceptible to reburning. The other concern is that, courtesy of Dan Cahan and at Scripps, we have been experiencing more frequent extended droughts. And so that drought-fire interaction could be a concern. Next slide. But a lot of the talks that are coming up today are talking about ways to manage and deal with the weeds and the invasive grasses. So I'd like to end on a more hopeful quote, also by Otto Leopold, and you can read it yourself. Thank you.
Alex, thank you so much. And I am going to go ahead and introduce our next speaker, or just hand it over to her, Dr. Witter with the National Park Service. You ready, Marty?
I am.
Great.
So first slide. Whoa, there we go. Good morning, everyone. The Santa Monica Mountains are one of the best known wildfire hotspots in California. There's a national recreation area boundary around most of the mountain range, and inside is a patchwork of public and private ownership and land uses from urbanization, park wildlands, undeveloped open space, and wildland urban interface and intermix. In this setting, conservation depends not only on the NPS and state park management of their own lands, but on collaboration with the local homeowners and communities, especially with respect to fire management. Next slide. The Santa Monica Mountains are, We have a long history of well-known wildfires that caused major home losses, starting with the Bel Air fire in 1961, and most recently, the 2018 Woolsey fire. As Hugh pointed out, the Woolsey fire was the third most costly and the 8th most destructive fire in the entire United States up to 2020. Our fire regime is dominated by extreme wind-driven Santa Ana events started by human ignitions. Wind-driven fires are responsible for the vast majority of home and economic losses in California because of their much faster rate of spread, closer proximity to urban areas, and burned areas with greater housing values.
And
Next
Marty?
slide.
Marty,
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. You're a little quiet.
Uh-oh.
Is there anything, can you move closer to the mic or anything?
How does that sound?
It's a little better. Just use your outside voice.
I thought I was using my outside voice. Let me, yeah. How's that?
Much better. That's great. Thanks.
Okay. I'll just crank up the microphone. So going back to this then is, so we're really dominated by extreme wind-driven Santa Ana events, and they're started by human ignitions. Wind-driven fires are responsible for the vast majority of home and economic losses in California because of their much faster rate of spread, closer proximity to urban areas, and burned areas with greater housing values. Next slide. We're also a biological diversity hotspot whose resources are threatened by frequent fire. As Alex explained, fire-driven type conversion is one of our biggest resource threats. The map on the lower right of our two most recent fires shows how individual fires dominate large parts of the landscape. After each fire, the ecosystem is reset according to the pattern of post-fire recovery. It also shows the minimum time we would want for these areas to remain unburned to reduce the probability of type conversion and increase the probability of good native recovery after the next fire. Next slide. Finding a wildfire solution means correctly identifying the problem. Much as forests may need fuel treatments, building forest resilience will not resolve the extreme wildfire challenges in the rest of California. The vast majority of losses from wind-driven fires outside of forests require an entirely different fire management strategy. The problem in the case of these fires is how to reduce structure losses and deaths, and how to maintain fire-resilient landscapes. There's now 20 years of research in support of strategies to meet these goals. With the 2017, 2018, and 2020 wildfires, the state began serious efforts to develop programs with significant investments to reduce wildfire impacts. Unfortunately, the fire behavior model for fuel management still dominates by focusing on increasing the pace and scale of fuel treatments. This message permeates the language and policy of statewide fire management. The problem is that this takes focus, energy, and resources away from more effective solutions for other areas of the state. Next slide. One of the worst of the indiscriminate messages is that we need to increase the amount of prescribed burning, a practice that the NPS in the Santa Monica Mountains stopped in the early 2000s because it was ineffective at protecting homes and damaging to the ecosystem. Next slide. The message of the need to increase prescribed burning is everywhere. This article was picked up by major news sources and headlined with, "Areas that were not increasing prescribed fire were not doing enough to mitigate fire risk and were compounding the fire deficit in the western U.S." This is bad science and a misrepresentation of needs in areas such as Southern California and the Great Basin, where prescribed fire does not save communities and can be an ecosystem killer. And the NRCS publication that asks, how can the NRCS get more fire on the ground, should ask first, where do we need to get more prescribed fire on the ground? Next slide. Oops, sorry about that, I missed that slide. Next slide. Chaparral has mostly been the undervalued stepchild of California ecosystems, but when a fire burns, its value to the human support system becomes immediately apparent as we start to pay the post-fire costs for secondary damages, infrastructure delays, loss of clean water, and debris removal. For those promoting fire-resilient landscapes, the older the age of chaparral, the more fire-resilient the landscape. We should be working to maintain intact chaparral habitat fire-free for as long as possible. We should not mindlessly be clearing it. We should ban the phrase brush clearance. Once lost, chaparral is not easily replaceable. Chaparral has not been successfully restored at scale, so thousands or tens of thousands of acres of degraded chaparral are likely to remain degraded on our time scale. Next slide. What should we do? Nationally, human-started wildfires account for 84% of all wildfires. I was disappointed in the introductory talk on day one that with all the new state wildfire programs, prevention was not highlighted. Of all the things we could do to manage for resilient ecosystems and fire-safe communities in Southern California, this is the most important. Next slide. The Bel Air fire was the first modern WUI fire. From it, we learned that fire-resistive construction reduced home losses and that vegetation modification within the first 100 feet, but especially the first 30 to 60 feet, provided the majority of the benefit. This result has been replicated with modern fires in large sample sizes and has repeatedly reached the same conclusion. The benefit of fuel modification to reduce structure losses occur within the first 100 feet of a structure, and the closer to the structure, the greater the benefit. Disturbingly, there are now efforts to expand the amount of fuel modification required for defensible space from 100 feet to 200 feet in LA County, and to increase the distance to 300 feet at the discretion of the Ventura County Fire Department in the updated Ventura County Local Coastal Plan. Next slide. Conservation and community wildfire safety are compatible when communities understand their risks and focus their efforts on the most effective wildfire survival strategies like home hardening. On day 3 of this symposium, Adam Kunch will be presenting an example with the Sustainable Defensible Space project that the RCD has been working on with the local communities in the Santa Monica Mountains. Thank you.
Marty, thank you so much. Lots to think about, and you kind of stole my thunder. I was going to say that Antoine was going to be joining us, and we're going to be discussing a lot of the relationships between people and fire. Continue to explore that on day 3 as our third session as well. So now I'd like to hand it over to Rachel Wing to talk about a partnership with CBG and Angeles National Forest. So we'll go east a little.
Hi, I'm Rachel Wing with the California Botanic Garden, formerly known as Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden, and our weed crew, which is a partnership with the Angeles National Forest. Next slide, please. So the birth of the weed crew was following the station fire in 2009, which was and actually still is the biggest fire in LA County history at over 160,000 acres. So the U.S. Forest Service undertook a burn area emergency response, also known as BEAR effort, to mitigate the immediate post-fire threats, including weeds either introduced during fire suppression activities or just being able to spread into disturbed areas, fire disturbed areas, and suppression related disturbed areas. Next slide. The forest botanist, Katie Van Zandt, at the time got together work parties to survey and to treat the advancing weeds that were observed getting into the burned areas, and that was kind of the birth of the weed crew. They were staffed by volunteers and staff, and they attacked a lot of arundo and Spanish broom, a whole lot of Spanish broom, which was pre-existing on the forest but was spreading as a result of the fire, and tamarisk. But they were only using physical removal methods. You see the guy at the bottom who's removing, I think it might be Scotch broom, with a weed wrench, which was the main tool of the weed crew at the time. Please, next slide. So Spanish broom has very deep roots, and the crew would have to dig deep pits in order to even get a place to put the weed wrench in. And this was not cost effective. And also it caused a lot of excess soil disturbance, which wasn't beneficial. And there was also issues of continuity because BEAR is strictly a 1-year post-fire program. And as I think probably everybody recognizes, it takes a lot longer than 1 year to mitigate persistent weeds. And also restoration was really needed in other parts of the Angeles, other watersheds that weren't necessarily related to a burn. So the solution was partnering with the garden, and that enabled a full-time dedicated crew to be on the ground year-round. And also they wanted to provide for herbicides to be used. So they went through the National Environmental Policy Act, the NEPA process, which took a long time. And the crew is now using an integrated pest management approach. So we're using whatever method is the most appropriate in the situation. Next slide, please. And we battle a lot of Spanish broom and arundo. We're using, on these, we're typically using a cut stump approach where we cut it and then we apply herbicide to the stump. Next slide. And there's a before and after of a patch of tamarisk or salt cedar. And in kind of a little bit behind the patch of tamarisk, you can see a little cottonwood, or not such a little cottonwood, that we've basically freed from competition with all that nasty salt cedar tamarisk. Next slide. The other fires that the weed crew has been involved in restoration efforts on were the powerhouse and the copper fire up in the Liebre Mountains. And those are older fires, but there was funding available due to settlements with the outfit that caused the fire. So major restoration efforts are happening there. But currently the weed crew is involved in kind of the end stages of the bear effort for the lake and the Bobcat fires from last year, from 2020. And in particular, they're surveying and treating dozer lines and checking for any new introductions, which actually we have not in this particular instance found, but we found a lot of spreading of pre-existing infestations. And the upper right photo shows that those dozer lines, when we can't get off-highway vehicle barriers put up quickly enough, dirt bike activity becomes a weed vector. We've observed a lot of spread of Russian thistle down these dirt bike lines on the dozer lines. And in the future, I'm sure we'll be doing more bear projects and then continuing hopefully with longer term restoration projects. Next slide. So thank you very much. That's the end.
Thank you, Rachel. It's so nice to hear about work that is happening, and Chris is going to continue in that vein. Chris.
Hello.
Hi. Take it away.
Thanks. So I'm talking about managing weeds in Southern California, reduce fire risks. And it's really great that I'm kind of wrapping this all up here, because a lot of the previous speakers talked a lot about, really got more into depth of what I'm talking about here today. Next slide. So unfortunately, when we're talking about weeds, we're talking about bad news, and I'm often the bad news messenger. Weeds are one of the most flammable vegetation types on our landscape in Southern California, and many of our weeds are annuals in Southern California, and our annual weeds are just much more flammable than perennial weeds. And as we keep increasing the amount of weeds on our landscape, we're increasing the likelihood of fires starting and spreading, especially near ignition sources. Marti and Hugh did a great job of pointing out that Southern California fires are oftentimes human caused and are oftentimes much more frequent than historic fire regimes. And just to really reiterate the point, I think Alex brought this up, annual grasses are one of the most flammable plants that are growing on our landscapes. And they're also one of the most abundant types of weed on our landscape. So when we're looking at a big grassland like this down here on the right, we're looking at just a giant flammable pile of weeds that keeps growing back mostly each and every year when we don't have a drought. Next slide. So I'm hoping that convinced you that weeds are basically fuels, and they're highly flammable fuels. And so if we are going to be reducing our fire risk, we really need to be reducing our fine flashy fuels in areas that have high ignitions. So such as roadsides, wildland urban interfaces, places like that. And so if you imagine yourself driving in your car, and we're all here in Southern California, most of us here in Southern California, we're all driving our red Ferraris down the highway. We're going so absolutely fast that sparks are shooting out of the back of the car. We're nailing it down here on the freeways. And we go around a curve and we hit some of the grasses on the side of the road. And that causes those grasses to ignite. And then as those grasses ignite, the fire moves off the side of the road into wildlands and what we call this fuel ladder type of model. And so what we really need is we really need to break this fuel ladder. And we're really trying to break it at the base by trying to have these fuel reduction or fuel-free areas near these ignition sources. Next slide. And these this goal of trying to reduce fire by reducing weeds is very, very similar to what we're all familiar with here on the right with defensible spacing, where we have different zones, where we allow vegetation farther away from the structures we want to save to have more to have more fuel, and anything near the house in that zone 1 or zone 0 to have a lot less fuel. And the same thing's happening on the left here on our roadside. So we want to have our road shoulders to be relatively low fuel loads. Next slide. So if we are trying to reduce fire and do that by reducing weeds, we're going to have to use a variety of methods to try and reduce weeds. We can first and foremost prevent weeds. Sometimes we're calling this biosecurity. We can use chemicals, livestock grazing, mulching, mowing, and hand tools. I'll go over these really quick, each of these methods really quickly. Go ahead. Next slide. Thanks. Step 0. So preventing weeds. This is really important. And Rachel brought this up just a little bit about preventing. If we can stop the spread of weeds before they even establish, that would be really great. So we're generally often pretty good at preventing the spread of weeds, but we're generally less good at preventing the establishment of new populations. And like Rachel showed with dirt bikes going out into the wild and dropping off new tumbleweed or whatever it is. Really simple question to ask yourself are what weeds are you or the public bringing into your site? And then follow that up with how are they bringing it into the site? And that gives you some idea of how you can be preventing these weeds. Next slide. So for example, if the problem is weed seeds that are on vehicles, are you able to clean the vehicles that are entering your site? Or are you able to prevent the vehicles from even entering the site at all? So really simple questions kind of help you clarify how you can be preventing weeds on your site. Next slide. Really popular method of weed control, especially at large scales, is herbicide chemical control methods. And that is because chemical control methods are one of the most effective and most economical methods of controlling weeds. And in many situations, especially in wildlands in Southern California, it's one of the most practical methods. We generally aren't going to be able to bulldoze lots of riparian areas that Rachel was showing with Arundo. We're going to need to use chemical methods to get rid of it. It does have a negative public perception, however. Next slide, please. Livestock grazing can be a great way to reduce weeds. Cows, goats, and sheep are the 3 livestock that we generally use down in Southern California. One of the biggest problems we have is that there's just not enough livestock to go around during the growing season to try and reduce fuel loads. It also can, when used incorrectly, can increase your weed population. So while you might be trying to reduce fuel loads in 1 year, you might accidentally increase fuel loads in your 2nd year, thereby amplifying your fire problems. And of course, cows don't belong on roadsides, things like that. So it can be incompatible with your site. So it doesn't fit everywhere, but there are some places where grazing can work and can work well. Next slide. Mulching can be used to reduce weed populations, and it also reduces fire spread and the risk of fire. Caltrans is starting to mulch a lot of freeway rights-of-ways, and that is a really cost-effective way of controlling weeds over long term. However, mulch itself is flammable. However, mulches are less flammable than annual grasses. So if your choice is something between annual grasses, which are highly, highly flammable, and mulch, by adding mulch, which is still a flammable material on the landscape, you're still reducing your fire risk because it's less flammable than the annual grasses that you would have had without mulch. Next slide. A lot of times we're using mowing on the sides of the roads and in other areas to reduce fuel loads. And it also reduces fuel height as well, which is another way of keeping the fire intensity low. So when there is an ignition in a mowed area, that fire will slowly creep through those relatively short fuels rather than burning much more fast when you have taller annual grasses or mustards or tumbleweeds. One of the problems with mowers, of course, is that it's a potential source of ignition, which is why you generally want to have a water source nearby so you can prevent any spread of fires. And the other issue, of course, is that mowers are spreading weed seeds around. So then you have to get back to preventing the mowers from spreading the weeds around. Next slide. Hand tools are a great way to reduce weeds. The problem, of course, is that they are only really limited to small scales, but if you have a small scale weed infestation, then there's generally a really good chance that you'll be using hand tools. And there are a wide variety of hand tools out there. There's tons that you probably have never heard of or even seen before. So keep your eyes open to different types of hand tools that might be just the right fit to get into that nook and cranny that weed's growing in and help you reduce some of your labor costs at trying to get out some of these really difficult to remove weeds. Next slide. I do want to mention, I've kind of brought this up in a couple of my slides, that scale really matters. And it is really, really important, because if we're trying to reduce fire risk and we're trying to reduce it at really large scales across Southern California, there's only a relatively few tools that we can use where we're trying to manage 10 acres or 10 roadside miles in a day. So many county crews or Caltrans are working at the scale of trying to reduce fuels across thousands of miles of roadside a year. And when you really divide up the work, they're trying to get done, 5-10 miles a day. And hand tools or even motorized weed whackers just aren't the appropriate tools when you're working on that type of a scale. So when we need to think big, we also need to think big about big tools. Last slide. I also want to put out a little plug for cooperative extension. Sabrina helped to kind of emphasize us a little bit earlier. We have trained experts across the state like me who are willing to assist you with land management or weed management issues. So feel free to reach out to us. We are oftentimes technical experts that can help you in these issues. And if you have home gardening or home landscaping issues, we have a whole group of thousands of master gardener volunteers spread all across the state who can help you with those type of issues in your home landscape. And so with that, thank you very much. And I'll turn it back over to Sabrina.
Hi, everyone. Am I being heard and seen
Yes.
if I need to be?
Yeah,
Good.
Sabrina, we can hear you good. Sorry about your power.
Yeah, my power went out during your talk, Chris. Apologies. So I'm joining in from my phone. So I do want to, actually, I'm going to go back to my office here. One of the questions that I wanted to start out with, after thanking all the panelists, thank you so much, everyone, for the excellent presentations. As someone who lived and works in Ventura County, I'm going to start out with a question for Hugh. That any panelist, if you want to jump in on a question, please do. So my first question is, I noticed that in the slide that you had, Hugh, of the most damaging fires in California, the Thomas Fire was not listed. And yesterday, not yesterday, sorry, but at our previous session, we started talking about flood after fire and how the impacts of fire, as you mentioned, smoke and air pollution are important, but there's also erosion and floods and debris flows. So can you address, we know that similar numbers of lives were lost if you include the Montecito debris flow in the Thomas Fire as the other fires that you mentioned. Can you kind of talk about how that's calculated and how we should be thinking about the impacts of fire?
Actually, the Thomas Fire it's on one of those tables. One of them, I think, is
it was on the size
largest
one,
fires and one is
the
most destructive. And the Thomas Fire killed 21 people and they all died in a post-fire debris flow. So I consciously made sure that was on the list, and actually it was on the one I think that mattered.
Oh.
But anyway, I think, yeah, that's a really important issue, and it tends to be a little bit more of an issue in Southern California for a variety of reasons. One is that the landscape in Southern California is very active. As some people on the call may know, the San Gabriel Mountains are among the fastest rising mountain ranges in North America. So there's a lot of upward movement happening. There's a lot of unconsolidated sediment. There's a lot of deposition of what we call dry gravel, or just sort of downslope gravel and sediment flow, even without input of rain. And so there's a whole lot of debris sitting above streams and in streams that's ready to be moved in the case of a lot of rain. And this is the other thing about Southern California is it's not really wet, but when the rain comes in, it really rains a lot. It often doesn't come in as drizzle that lasts for days, but rather it'll come in as a gully washer and move a lot of material very quickly down drainage slopes. And so for people like myself who live in Northern California, I remember the first couple of times I was in SoCal, I always wondered what these weird little reservoirs were at the base of every one of the gullies coming out of every mountain range down there. And I thought, there's no water here. Why would they be holding water in these things? Well, that's not what they're for, right? They're to hold all the millions of tons of debris that are pouring off the mountains every year. And if you look at the annual budget for some of the Southern California counties that they spend a year in removing material from those debris basins, it's unbelievable. I thought it was a joke. I thought someone had added like a zero or two to the numbers. It's tens of millions to hundreds of millions of dollars to get used in any given year just to move that debris out of the way. So there are a lot. So anyway, I mean, that's kind of the big issue, right? Very friable soils, quickly rising mountain ranges, steep slopes, fires that burn the vegetation off of the slopes, really heavy rainfall that when it comes in, it moves a lot of material, and a whole lot of homes built right in the middle of all of this stuff. Back when people didn't think there was really an issue, but there is a big issue. I don't know what else to say about that. I would say, please don't build homes there. Please don't rebuild homes there, but I don't get to say that as a federal employee, so delete everything I just said.
Sabrina, you're on mute.
Hi, sorry. You've set us up really well for the next question that I had there. But does anyone else want to respond to the first question? Or I'll jump right in, and if you have something that you wanted to say it as you answer second things. I'm gonna ask Marti or Alex to kind of start us off on this one. So people love generalities, right? It makes life a lot easier to say things like, we just need to put more fire on the landscape in California. How do we, a lot of you, did a great job of describing the ecological differences between fire in different kinds of habitat in such an incredibly ecologically diverse state. But how do we move further with getting our state, federal, and local agencies to actually make sure that the diversity of our ecologies is represented in the diversity of responses? Marti or Alex, you want to start us off on that one?
Well, I mean, I can just speak from my own personal experience, which is that I present in talks like this. I talk to reporters, and every opportunity I have to educate people about, there is not a one size fits all strategy that's appropriate. You need different strategies for different regions. But I think it's people who are in a position to reach a lot of other people need to be educated. Marti, what do you think?
I agree completely. Like you, I feel like we've been saying the same message for a minimum of 15 years.
Yeah, more.
Yeah. I think that starting at the top level of the state agencies that are managing these wildfire projects is an excellent place to start. And I think there is an effort underway to do that. So I'm hopeful that it has to be very high up, and it has to be people who have power to change the language in some of these policy statements.
Right. I just as a general, having been doing this for a couple of decades, I do hear the language shifting a little bit. I do hear more and more people at least acknowledging that fire is too frequent in chaparral and that they're different ecosystems. I also am starting to hear more people talk about land use planning, which is, I've been studying land use and fire for a very long time, and people used to look at me like I had 3 heads if I talked about it. But now it's actually, I'm seeing it in the media. I'm hearing people in different state agencies talking about it. So I think that's also a positive.
Yeah, and I'll just say that one of our collaborators on projects, I guess, that we've been trying to get going, Alex, you and I, Van Bootzik, who specifically addresses land use and land use change and fire, is going to be joining us at the next session in October.
Well, wanted
There was
to.
one, go ahead, Rachel. I was going to make a
sorry.
point, but please.
I
go
just
ahead.
wanted to add kind of a plug for the Community Wildfire Protection Plan process. I worked in the city of Monrovia and worked on our CWPP at the time, and actually all of my joint panelists, I was trying to bring their research into our process, and one of our actually members or participants here, Karen Suarez, was on our community panel for that. And it's very hard to change the dialogue in like the fire department. You would often hear the fire chief say, this area hasn't burned for so long, and put that out as a problem. But we did try to inject a lot of the science and try to change the dialogue around. And actually, I would have to say we snuck into our CWPP the words climate change.
Ooh, impressive. And we are also going to be talking about community wildfire protection planning in the Santa Monica's with Worry Skay at our next session as well. Marty, did you want to respond to that too, or should I ask another question?
No, that's great.
I had a thing I want to say real quick. I just
Yeah.
in sort of in the defense of the Forest Service, and we're I wouldn't call us a large federal agency, but we're a federal agency that manages a lot of land, and we move like a big ship, and things turn slowly, and it takes a while to stop things and to start things. But if you look at the forest plans that were revised in Southern California, it's more than 15 years ago at this point. There was a pretty profound shift in the ecological understanding that's reflected in those documents about the need for or the rationale for using fire as a management tool. And there was a major shift away from the intent in the original forest plans from 15 to 20 years earlier, which was to maintain a mosaic of a lot of ages on the landscape and using fire to do a lot of that. And so I will say that it was heartening to see that science did play a major role in changing the way that the Forest Service, looks generally at the use of fire and habitat chaparral. And I think that's a positive development. You don't see a lot of positive developments at that level in agencies. That said, remember that the agency is managed by people, and we are dealing with people, and every person has a slightly different opinion or a very different opinion about what to do and where to do. So these broad scale regulatory type and guidance type documents don't necessarily completely constrain people's desire to use fire. So there's a lot of this, the socio-ecological part of this, socioeconomic part of this is massive, right? Interactions directly between stakeholders and managers. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say.
Definitely.
Hugh gets full credit for acknowledging the chaparral and working to get the message right. So we're not talking about you, Hugh.
Let's see. I have two questions I could queue up here. I think I'll do it this way. So back to the way I started that question about generalities. Another generality that people often say, and this is, I don't know, maybe the first question was geographic, and this one's a little more, I don't know, temporal or something. So another generality that we often hear is, well, California is adapted to fire. Southern California is adapted to fire. Chaparral and scrublands are adapted to fire. And yet, I think there's a reason to say that when you're trying to push retaining some of these ecosystems, but we can see that whether it's climate change or other anthropogenic forces or other things going on, these generalities are not, people aren't understanding some of the nuances. Does anyone want to comment on that?
One of the things that makes it hard is that I try to say California vegetation is adapted to specific fire regimes. But fire regime is jargon to lay people. But, that's the great irony, right? The obligate cedars require fire, but they're the ones that are most threatened by frequent fire. It is a challenge. I agree.
Yeah, that was well said, Alex. I mean, I think that's a standard. I think probably I saw that originally in a John Keeley quote from something a few decades ago, but it makes the great point, which I think all of us try to pass on to people we talk with is plants aren't adapted to fire, they're adapted to specific fire regimes. And the best example is just to take your yellow pine systems, which are really common across the Western US, versus the chaparral or sagebrush systems, which are also relatively common, and they're completely different animals. They have different adaptations, they have different responses to fire. You look at all the things when it comes from frequency to patch size to severity to intensity, they're just wildly different. And in both cases, you have species that you can talk about being quote unquote adapted to fire, but their adaptations don't work if the other fire regime all of a sudden becomes the rule of the day. And that's what happened in a lot of Western forests. What was a frequent fire, low severity system has turned essentially into a giant chaparral. Basically,
Really tall.
Yeah, the canopy is connected to the surface now. And I mean, that's the big deal with the chaparral systems. If it's going to burn, it's going to go kaboom. And that's what happened. Whereas in forest, that's not predetermined unless you are able to, restrict the ability, the occurrence of the disturbance in the system long enough to fill it with fuels. So that's what we're seeing. We're seeing gigantic chaparral fires essentially in California now. It's just that they're in forest.
Yeah.
I wanted to add something regarding kind of the nuance of something that's adapted to disturbance, but specific kind of disturbance. And also in Monrovia, we have a population of a federally endangered plant called the Broughton's milkvetch, and it happens to be present on a fire road. And that plant is adapted to disturbance, but the clearing of the fire road was a pretty significant disturbance. And at least one year that clearing happened right after the plant flowered. And so I get a response sometimes saying, we have to manage this properly. And people say, well, but it's disturbance adapted. It likes disturbance. And it was very important to manage that disturbance properly.
Yeah. Okay, so the second question that I had, kind of going back to the idea of state and federal support, and of course support can mean support with the fantastic research that a lot of our state and federal agencies do, and it can also mean money. So I'm going to address this one to Chris. How do we get agencies to understand that weeds need to be a part of our thinking about fire and provide more financial support for invasive plant management?
That's a great question, which generally means that there isn't a good answer for it. I think that the movement in a lot of agencies, state and federal, is starting to move toward weed management. One of the big issues is speed of policy, like Rachel kind of mentioned with NEPA. It can take a very long time for a forest to develop a NEPA for weeds. And then, the NEPA is area specific. So if you don't have a blanket NEPA for the entire forest, then when you have a weed population that pops up, 100 feet beyond your border, you have to do another NEPA. So it definitely is moving, but it is a very large ship that needs to be steered in the right direction. And of course, the other issue is funding, and weeds are not necessarily seen as something that needs to be controlled all the time, and it's not generally viewed as the source of the fire. We're often talking about overfueled forests. We're not talking about the car that broke down on the side of the road, that catalytic converter ignited all the annual grasses on the side of the road that caused that 100,000 acre fire. So it's things like that where, the public is generally focused on, we have an overstocked forest, where the very simple measure is, well, if we had a lot less fuels on the side of our road shoulders, we would reduce our fire ignitions by X%. And so that's definitely a difficult message. And then the other issue, of course, is scale. If we've got, thousands upon thousands of miles of roadsides in Southern California, many of them are in highly flammable areas. And basically our only tool, especially in mountain areas, is herbicides on the side of the road. We're not going to be mowing the steep, relatively cliff faces on some of the roads in the Angeles and the San Bernardino and the San Jacintos as well. So when you're looking at something that's really, really steep and is, generally has a good fuel load on the side of the shoulder, you're looking at herbicides. And there's, like I said, there's real negative public perception with using herbicides, especially when using them on thousands of miles of road, because then you're applying thousands of gallons of herbicide. And that really scares some people.
Yeah. Yeah. Can I get a little time check from Eileen or Drew? I've got Zoom big on my phone and I can't see my clock.
Yeah, you're doing great. We've got around another 10 minutes. So
fantastic.
Yep, we're good.
Great, terrific. Okay, well, then in that case, I'm going to jump into another question that kind of takes us away from thinking about agencies and what they can do. What is the role that the community kind of needs to play in addressing fire management, invasive weed protection, all of these kinds of things? And by community, I can mean anyone from business interests in land development or in horticulture, down to individual HOAs and homeowners. Rachel, I'm gonna direct this one towards you, since I know of your experience working with the city of Monrovia too.
Yeah, the thing that came immediately to mind is to promote native plant palettes or appropriate plant palettes. And person I already mentioned, Karen Suarez in Monrovia, has been really active in this, in getting more native plant sales, and actually the local gardening group, trying to introduce ideas other than roses, and community education. Those are good ones. I'm also thinking about people who already are recreationists in the wild, just having more awareness of things they bring in on their boots and such like. I don't really know how to advance that, but that's another thing that I'm thinking of.
Yeah, we haven't talked about this too much today, but an area that I've been working in a lot over the past couple of years is how do we manage post-fire erosion control in a way that isn't adding to these kinds of issues. And so that's a whole other set of questions about seeding and replanting and the whole concept that everybody wants to get out there after the fire and plant things. And it's hard for volunteers to think about removing what's green instead of what's planting it. I mean, I remember a city council person in LA saying, well, we had this fire in Griffith Park, but look, now it's all this beautiful gold. Like, yeah, that's all invasive mustard. So anyone else, like Marti or Alex, Chris, want to join into this conversation?
Marti.
Don't all jump in at once.
It's definitely been an issue with us at the Park Service. After every single fire, people have wanted to come in and plant trees. Although now that our oak trees are dying, we actually have the opportunity to go in and plant trees now. We at the park after fires, we normally, one of our most consistent focuses is on weed removal. So, but with the Woolsey fire, and I think you'll hear more about this from Antoine on day 3, we're actually trying to do a much broader outreach and work with homeowners who lost their homes and we have pretty substantial funding to help them more sustainable and native palettes. And I think that the way to reach people is people really need to understand their personal risk. And the better they understand their personal risk and they understand what the solutions are to that personal risk, the more likely they are to take appropriate actions. So that's where we're really focusing a lot of our efforts right now.
Yeah, I still use your no donut holes
Oh, yeah.
slide when I'm talking about near fire landscaping. And I
Yeah.
will just put in a pitch for my own program here for a sec. A lot of this information is also in the Santa Monica Mountains Fire Alliance set of resources and materials that Antoine will be talking about. But Marti, you and me and Drew and Kathleen did a lot of work on the Safe Landscapes project a few years ago, and I'll make sure the link is on our resources page.
Great.
By the way, also just put in a promo for our resources page. If you go back to the symposium page where you signed up for the sessions, we have a lot of resources being added there. And one of the things that we really tried to address is, aside from managing the invasive weeds pre and post fire, if we can get people not to create these source populations in their own landscaping, either pre-fire with their near home landscaping or post-fire, again, with the idea of replanting and reseeding, you know, making sure, working with the nursery industry and others to try to really promote appropriate, ideally native plants in fire-resistant landscapes. Chris, do you want to say anything about that? We talked a lot about that too, and about sort of the role native plants can play in kind of weed prevention.
Yeah, and you know, a lot of our weeds, and especially the most flammable ones, are growing in generally disturbed areas, so post-burn or even just disc-tilled mode or grazed. So it's this trade-off between having clearance from a structure or property line to ensure that you have that defensible space, but also allowing something to grow there that's more native and less flammable. Shaded fuel breaks can definitely help if done properly. But also it's tough because a lot of our weeds are just really aggressive bullies compared to a lot of the wildflowers that we have in Southern California. So something like goldfields, which, you know, is generally 6 to 8 inches tall and, you know, won't be too much of a fuel source, especially compared to something like bromes or oats, which are, you know, 3 to 4 feet tall. So much less flammable fuel type, but, you know, growing growing gold fields in a patch with invasive grasses, the invasive grasses are just going to outcompete them. So yeah, after a couple of years, if you don't maintain that wildflower patch and keep those invasive plants out, you're going to revert right back to annual grasses. So it's great for a couple of years, but over time it will revert back to these highly flammable invasive plants, which of course then costs a whole lot more money than just mowing, you know, huge swaths. So yeah, that's a problem.
Yeah, and I again, just to put sort of a plug in there for programs that we work on and other people do as well, you know, our approach to pest management and weed management is to take an integrated approach, and with vegetation management as well. So integrated vegetation management, integrated pest management. And it's not just about how you treat what's there, it's also about how you favor creating or recreating a more functional landscape that can support habitat, which of course we'll be talking more about, you know, less about the vegetation itself and more about it as habitat for animals in the next panel in our session today. Do any of you have, yes.
Hey, I
Hi.
just want to just give you a time check. We've got a couple minutes left, and a reminder for the panelists that there are questions in the Q&A. So if you and they can kind of make sure that those are taken, they're aware of those too, that they can come back to. But I'll let you finish up with a couple more statements, and I'll see you a little bit.
I just wanted to comment on your, just make a statement, Sabrina, related to your comments on the, we have to find a way to get people off their blanket fear of herbicide use. Basically, when it comes to invasive species, that's all we got. I mean, there's some other things we can do that take an outrageous amount of time and effort and feel good and look good, but they don't solve anything. So, I mean, that's a big issue, and I know that cooperative extension is involved in these kinds of interactions with people all the time. But an example in forest landscapes is I did a study with a graduate student of mine not that long ago, where we showed that judicious use of herbicides actually was a major driver, positive driver of native species diversity in severely burned plantation lands in the Sierra Nevada, and that without using that, you ended up with a monoculture either of a single weed or either of a single native shrub species. And then if you actually want to, manage for enhanced diversity of, you name it, pollinator services and all sorts of other stuff, that actually use of a little bit of herbicide at the right time in those plantations in their early lifespan had a lot to do with what was on the ground, and it was mostly positive. And I'll just remind people that disturbances in general, like I know a lot of people also are worried about, grazing, sheep, goats, when to use it, how to use it, and then every tool has its place. The issue is where, when, how much, and tying that to the local ecology and what you really want to do. And just all you have to do is look at the way management happens in Europe. If you go to the UK, their most diverse grasslands are those chalk grasslands along the coast, and they have to graze the crap out of them with sheep, because if they don't, none of their native species survive. Well, the sheep weren't there, 4,000 years ago, but without them, you got nothing. So anyway, they're complex discussions, but there isn't a blanket answer to this stuff,
I'd like to add that, the picture that people have of herbicide application is the person with the 4-gallon backpack sprayer, or even, helicopters or big machines. And our crew actually most typically applies herbicide from 60 milliliter dropper bottles. But I think if people kind of have that picture, they might have a different attitude.
Thank you for those closing thoughts. I've been informed that we're out of time. Boy, we could talk about this stuff for 2 more hours easily, of course. And Hugh, I really appreciate your comment about, these are complex issues, and it's hard for people to deal with complexity. And, we can't just go back to the way things were, because they're just not that way anymore. But yeah, we need to take sophisticated approaches that consider kind of all of these different variables. So with that, I want to thank all of our panelists. This has been a fantastic discussion. Thank you again. And Eileen, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Thanks, Sabrina. Actually, I'm going to say it's going to go to Steve.
Oh, okay. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sabrina. We really appreciate it. And thank you to all the panel members. There was a lot of back and forth discussion there, and everybody was willing to chime in. So thanks very much for that. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and it's 10:33 right now. So we're going to convene again at 10:38 so that people have a short time to do what they need to do. And then after that 5-minute break, we're going to have Richard Rachman from the Cal State Northridge, who specializes in studying plant ecology of native and invasive plants in Los Angeles area. And he'll share a few words about wildflowers following fire. So we look forward to that in about 5 minutes at 10:38. Okay, we'll see you back in 5 minutes. I will be getting back started again in about 30 seconds. Okay, well, welcome back, everybody. I know it was only a short break of 5 minutes, but we want to try to give both you a chance to take a break, but also keep things on track so that we are able to fit everything in. And so welcome back, and join me in welcoming Richard Rachman. He's a Cal State University graduate student. His master's thesis is looking at the impact wildfires and drought disturbances have on oak woodlands in the Santa Monica Mountains, and he'll share a few words about two wildflower that follow wildfire. Boy, that's tough to say, but this is our flower power talk, and then we'll go into the next panel after that. Thank you, Richard, for joining us today.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I could keep my video off or on, but okay. Anyhow, so like was explained, I'm going to be talking about fire followers. Okay, so I am going to do my video. Cool. I'm going to be talking about fire followers. These are typically wildflowers and shrubs that follow wildfires, right? Again, my name is Richard Rachman. I'm a plant ecologist. I'm a CSUN grad student, master's student, hopefully in my future PhD student. And my handle for social media at iNaturalist is a wandering ecologist. Cool. And so in the left corner here, you got Delphinium cardinal, scarlet larkspur, and then in the right, you have fire poppies and some Phacelia brachyloba too. Yeah, so let's, next slide. Okay, so I'm going to talk about what happens after a wildfire. I worked on this as a consultant with Leslie Gorin. Check out her website. She does this really cool artistic renditions of natural history in Los Angeles and around Southern California. So after a wildfire, you kind of get this bloom, like this wave of blooms, like it changes color from one color one week to another color the next week. And it's actually quite amazing and beautiful. So, and underground, you have these huge root systems of perennial plants. Like in the right corner, you see wild cucumber, and as well as morning glory. So you see these whites come up after a wildfire, as well as these like deep purples from things like shooting stars, and then from seeds that have been sitting in the seed bank of arroyo lupins, and then phacelias, which haven't been seen in some areas for decades. All of a sudden, huge populations of phacelias will be popping up. After a few months, you'll start getting, or after a few weeks, I'm sorry, you'll start getting things like California poppy, right? Fire poppy, things like that. So different colors start coming up, oranges, reds, more phacelias, right, start popping up. And then eventually you'll get more of the asters, more of the yellows in May and June, post-fire. I just love this illustration a lot. So please go check out Leslie's website if you can. Next slide. Yeah, so I wanted to show this illustration. Now, these two pictures aren't going to be the exact same hillside, but this is the Santa Monica Mountains. This is chaparral woodland, mostly Adenostoma fasciculatum, chamise woodland, or I'm sorry, chaparral shrubland, with some, you can see some Our Lord's candle, Hesperia yucca whipplei there. Now, this is right after the Woolsey fire, right? And if you click one more time, it should come up. And this isn't that exact hillside, but this is really normal for what happens. Now we do have some mustard in there, but for the most part, that's chaparral weed, chaparral shrubs, and a lot of Phacelia and wildflowers that come up. So this is really normal if you get a good rain following the year, after the Woolsey fire, we did have a pretty good rain. So that increased a lot of species richness in a lot of the vegetation plots that were being studied in the Santa Monica Mountains. Next slide. Yeah, so two of the few post-fire strategies I'm going to talk about. One of them is for the scarlet larkspur, right? And that's going to be perennial fleshy roots. So perennial meaning they live year after year, right? So scarlet larkspurs, Delphinium cardinale, they're often, they don't really have dormant seeds. So often, right? These larkspurs will show up in the holes in chaparral where they can eke out space. And they flower really a lot, like when conditions are right. So typically like right after a wildfire, it's a ton of space where they can really grow quickly, flower typically by like April, May, June, and you'll see a ton of red everywhere. So that combination of chemical cues in the soil, but also space and water, those are all really important environmental factors. Can you click again? Now this is an iNaturalist distribution of scarlet larkspur. As you can see, it's a lot of all throughout Los Angeles in the mountains. Typically, it's going to be in chaparral, though it can kind of go into coastal sage scrub and oak woodland as well. Can you click again? Really beautiful red flowers that attract hummingbirds. And then you can see one of its petals has evolved to kind of be this, this larkspur, right? Hence its name. You can click again. Here's from the Jepson manual. Seeds are really tough. The fruits have these really interesting shape to them. And I just love these illustrations to the Jepson manual. So if you're not familiar with the Jepson manual, it's a collection of the flora of California. But most of it's available now online for free. So please get familiar. It's a really great tool for up and coming botanist. Next slide. Yeah, so fire poppies, right? So more often dormant seeds that can lay in the soil for years and years and years and years, right? Though the perennial bulbs like the scarlet larkspur will come up in the seed bank after a wildfire, it's typically they're coming from those roots. They're just resprouting from roots. Now, fire poppies are different in that a lot of times they're annual, so they live and die in a single year, right? But they'll more often come up from the seed bank. So once their seed coat is scratched or like, I'm sorry, the word's skipping me right now. Once it's broken, once the seed coat's broken, those characins can get in. Now, characins are these compounds that there's a bunch of different types of characins. They're formed from the smoke and the burnt vegetation that occurs when shrubs are burnt, right? So the soil is inundated with these characins as well as like nitrogen and phosphorus and stuff. But these characins signal to the plant as well as heat stress, the signal to the plant to begin germination. So once that hard seed coat is broken, then annuals like fire poppies can emerge. Can you please click? Thank you. Again, this is from iNaturalist, a great community science app that you can have on your cell phone and on your computer, on your desktop. Highly recommend everyone get involved in taking pictures with their cell phone and posting them on iNaturalist. Now, the fire poppy is not as common as the scarlet larkspur, and this is typically going to be seen in chaparral. This plant evolved from a lineage of poppies that was mostly in alpine habitats. And it's over time kind of settled into this ecological niche, this space of being a disturbance-adapted, fire-adapted plant within the chaparral ecosystem. So really interesting evolutionary history. You can see super bright, beautiful flowers that kind of like wave in the wind and attract lots of really neat pollinators. So a plant that looks sort of similar, but you're like, oh, well, there's like major differences. And this is from George Sherman from the Santa Monica Trails Council. Let me use this diagram he made, is the wind poppy. So the wind poppy looks kind of similar. It's a little smaller, and it's got that cute little puff on the stigma, right? And then on the right side, you have the fire poppy, which is not going to have that cute little puff on the stigma. Still pretty cute, a little bigger. Just a wonderful addition to the post-fire landscape. I typically see them in like April, maybe May after a wildfire. In the Santa Monica Mountains and Sandstone Crest and Casper Crest and stuff. I see them a lot there. Sandstone Peak and Casper Crest, yeah. Next slide. Yeah, so thank you so much. Please follow me on iNaturalist. Follow other of your favorite scientists on iNaturalist. Post yourself on iNaturalist. Make a profile, it's a really cool thing. Join your local chapter of the California Native Plant Society. More so than just joining on social media, go on Zoom or eventually in person and meet people and network with other plant nerds. And please go volunteer in restoration efforts, such as what happens with SAMO Fund and the National Park Service with Santa Monica Mountains, or oak events with RCD, SMM. Thank you so much for having me and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Richard. We appreciate it. And I really enjoyed the slides. I really enjoyed looking at the colors and just understanding how things come back after wildfires. And we all wish you the best in your efforts on your master's degree and on your PhD. So thanks very much. So going on to the next part of our program, we'd like to welcome Travis Moncourt. Travis is going to moderate our next panel. Welcome, Travis. He's been a longtime friend of the Council for Watershed Health. Travis conducts research on the conservation of biodiversity in cities and beyond, including the investigation of the effects of artificial light, night lighting on wildlife mapping, modeling, and the management of species and habitats, and the construction of historical landscapes to better understand current and future land management options. He's been recognized for his many contributions to endangered species conservation by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the White House Conference on Cooperative Conservation. Welcome, Travis. We're really happy to have you here.
Thank you so much. I think I need permission to turn my video on if people want to see me, or I can just be a disembodied voice. That's fine. There we go. So welcome everybody to this next panel addressing more of wildlife responses to fire. If we could get the next slide. So I'll be moderating. We'll hear first from Ed Pert from California Department of Fish and Wildlife on issues facing the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. Then Carlton Rochester from U.S. Geological Survey on the Bobcat fire in 2020, its impacts, emergency salvage. Next slide. Followed by Kendall Calhoun, who's a PhD candidate at the University of California, Berkeley, monitoring oak woodland wildlife communities following the Mendocino complex fire. And then two related presentations from Megan Jennings, San Diego State University, and Erin Conlisk from Point Blue Conservation Sciences, dealing with connectivity, connecting wildlands, wildlife and communities, planning for wildfire and climate resilience in Southern California, and connectivity under fire, assessing the impacts of wildfire and climate change on Southern California landscapes. As you all know, full bios of everyone are in your materials for the conference, and encourage everybody to follow up on those. So I'm excited about this this panel, building on the vegetation impacts, conversion, etc., and thinking more about the wildlife issues. So if we go to our next slide, we will start here with Ed Pert from California Department of Fish and Wildlife. Ed, welcome.
All right. Thank you, Travis, and good morning, everyone. Yeah, I'm Ed Pert. I'm the regional manager for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife South Coast region. And that region includes the 5 coastal counties from Santa Barbara down to San Diego. Next slide, please. And the department has a lot of different aspects to what we do. And so I'm just going to try to give you a survey of these areas, and I'll go really quickly through these and happy to take any questions at the end. Next slide, please. So as we know, you can click for the next picture. Fire reduces habitat and forces wildlife from their homes. And the next picture, these 3 pictures here are from a field cam that one of my staff sent me. And I thought it just gave a good sense of what wildlife are probably dealing with and seeing with a fire coming their way. Next slide. Oh, you got to go through these again. I'm sorry. You get to see those again, I guess. When wildlife are displaced from their homes, we have a lot more human wildlife interactions, and we have scenarios like you see in the photos here. The bottom right photo is one of our volunteers. We often send our volunteers out to these communities to try to educate people on how to deal with wildlife in their neighborhoods and their backyards and things like that. Next photo. Next slide. Just more of the same about, dealing with these different aspects of human wildlife interactions. Sometimes we have to move animals and, we have a lot of animals getting into people's trash. But the most interesting one from me anyway, is the middle one, where we often have in a media market like LA, just a lot of media attention on animals post-fire. And so we oftentimes spend a lot of time just dealing with the media and answering questions. And it forces us to be very, very careful in the decisions we make with regard to wildlife management and fire. Next slide, please. I had to throw this one in because one of my staff sent me this. It was so cute. And it just sort of highlights the fact that you never know what you're going to deal with when wildlife are fleeing from fire. So next slide, please. We also do a lot of wildlife rescues. Animals get hurt or they're not able to get into their natural habitat after a fire. And so we have to do a lot of rescues. Next slide. This was a really interesting case that was actually in the national media maybe a couple of years ago or so, where our vets working alongside some vets at UC Davis discovered somehow that applying tilapia skin on burn wounds of bears and mountain lions at the time, but it works in other animals we've discovered, can really expedite the healing process. And it allows us to release those animals back into the wild, and the skin stays on there for as long as it does, long enough for the wound to heal, and then falls off, and really allows us to save a lot more wildlife and allow them to get back into the wild more quickly than otherwise. Next slide. And next photo. We also do a lot of fish rescues, and this is in Soledad Creek. It was a rescue for unarmored three-spine stickleback, a state and federally listed species. And this is our biologist out there in the field prior to a fire and flooding event. And note the little arrow in the middle of the picture. And next photo, please. This is what it looked like after the fire. And I don't remember which fire this was, but this is not atypical of the kind of conditions we see post-fire after large winter storms. And so you can see that there's absolutely no habitat there. And without us getting in there and intervening, we would not have that population there. And fish rescues get complicated. I don't have time to go into that, but yeah, it's a very interesting process. Next slide, please. This is just a photo. We were talking about someone was talking about the Woolsey fire earlier. And if you just look at the major drainages there, you can see that when we have a fire that covers the kind of area like the Woolsey fire, there's a lot of water and watersheds for us to go and survey and do potential fish rescues or other animal rescues. So it takes a lot of staff to do that, which we are low on, like probably the rest of you, and it takes a lot of time. Next slide, please. And this is just an example of what habitat can look like prior to a fire in LA County. Just excellent fish habitat, excellent wildlife habitat. Next slide shows you what it looks like after that. And it goes from beautiful habitat to completely unsuitable. And this is why we have to get out there and be proactive in rescuing fish and other wildlife, aquatic wildlife. Next slide, please. We also have over 1 million acres in the Department of Lands, and we have to deal with fires on our own lands. And just want to put that in there as examples. Won't spend much time on this. Next slide, please. One thing you might not think about from a department perspective, but our law enforcement staff spend a lot of time working with other enforcement agencies in offering mutual aid when there are fires occurring. So you can imagine that we have human health and safety issues. We have evacuations that they get involved with, as well as animal rescues at the same time. We have all these things going on at the same time. So our law enforcement folks are really, really important in our fire response. Next slide, please. We also participate in what was mentioned earlier by one of the speakers, these burned area emergency response teams, or BEAR teams. These are multidisciplinary teams to assess fire damage and figure out how to mitigate and remediate for fire damage. And we participate in these whenever we need to. As a manager, it's sometimes tough to participate in these simply because they're under the incident command system. So once you go into one of those situations, you cannot be released until the incident commander releases you. And we've had staff stay on well over a month for these, and that really impacts our ability to do our other job. So they're really important, but they can be a little bit dicey to become involved with. Next slide, please. We also have regulatory streamlining. This is mostly when it comes to fire in our stream bed alteration program, where we allow jurisdictions and entities to do work that would normally require a permit. They can do it under an emergency provision and then come back after the fact and get a permit, and we can then figure out if there's any mitigation or remediation that we can require or is really, really necessary. But it's a very streamlined process. Next slide. And then lastly, interestingly, I don't think a lot of people think about this unless you're a hunter or an angler or something like that, but there's a lot of recreational opportunity that's lost due to fire when you have forest closures and we have to close our land. So especially for the hunting community, where they may have received a lottery ticket to hunt in an area that it's a once in a lifetime hunt, and you have a forest closure. And in the past, they haven't had any way to get back in line, get their money back or get back in line to those areas. And we're working on that right now. But it's just something that people don't think of very often. And then lastly, I was reminded by some of the previous speakers that I should mention, especially for this group, that we have a number of grant programs where we give a significant amount of funds for restoration, other things. And typically when there is a fire, the department works with other agencies in the governor's office to try to prioritize post-fire restoration. And so if you are any of those entities that do that type of work, then I hope you are in the loop on those programs that are out there. And if not, contact me or my staff, and we can help you to hopefully get some money to do some good work post-fire for restoration efforts. And that's it. I'm looking forward to answering any questions or comments people have and hearing the rest of the speakers. And thank you very much for inviting me to this. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Ed. I'm sure there'll be lots of discussion as we go forward. We appreciate the presentation. Next up is Carlton Rochester from the Western Ecological Research Center of the USGS, talking about Bobcat Fire 2020 impacts and emergency salvage.
All right, thank you very much for having me here today. I'm going to be giving Robert Fisher's presentation on our emergency salvage of mountain yellow-legged frogs from a site within the 2020 Bobcat fire. Next slide, please. So just kind of a background of our fire history within the lab. We had a big introduction in 2003 when most of Southern California was on fire simultaneously. Next slide, please. Which kind of repeated in 2007. Again, there are multiple fires burning up and down Southern California. Next slide. And so with each of these, we kind of learned a little bit of different things as we were going along. 2009 saw the station fire. I think Rachel had a good map of that in her presentation. Next slide, please. And then in 2020, we had the Bobcat fire. Rachel's map actually had a good presentation of the Bobcat fire, was right next to the station fire. Next slide, please. And so one of the notable things about the Bobcat fire is just the size of this thing. It actually spanned from the city on the south all the way up and over the San Gabriel Mountains. It was like 32 kilometers north to south. And the lines that we have highlighted here are yellow-legged frog habitat sites. And the one that I'm going to focus on is right there in the middle. It's called Little Rock Creek. And there is a population of endangered mountain yellow-legged frogs that live in this site. Next slide, please. And so just kind of looking at fire impacts and how wildlife respond to them, we kind of went backwards in this. So like our introduction to fire was in 2003, but we kind of started looking at wildlife response to it in the following spring. And we found like, okay, there's animal impacts, there's species missing. And then in 2007, we started looking sooner after the fires, and we were seeing the debris flows and the change in habitat. And then in 2009, we were actually like out on the ground during the fires. And so it kind of just, we kind of, like the impacts of fires kind of happen in fall with the fires and then winter and spring, but we kind of got into it a little bit backwards. And it just took us a little while to get on the ground in some of these fires and learn all the behaviors of what we needed to be doing. Next slide, please. And so within the U.S. Geological Survey, there's lots of different disciplines, and one of them is looking at risks assessments. And these are some statistical models developed by Sue Cannon, looking at debris flow patterns based on the level of fire severity, slopes, and then also rainfall. And the graph down at the bottom right, you get an idea of like how much rainfall has to occur within a certain amount of time. And then you would expect debris flow. Now, these models were developed to protect human life and property. And what we've kind of learned over the years, over our experience on the ground with fire, is that these may not actually be sensitive enough to start predicting damages to wildlife habitat. Next slide. Damage to wildlife habitat can begin immediately after fire. And I think Ed just had some slides about fire impacts and change in habitat. This is a mountain yellow-legged frog site. And you can see on the before picture, there's lots of nice nooks and crannies in here. There's some pools, but in the after photo, that's all been filled in. And so, the yellow-legged frogs don't typically do well when they have that much debris coming down over the top of them. Next slide. We often think about changes in habitat in the following winter associated with winter rains, but changes in habitat can actually start even earlier than that. As the fire is burning, we frequently see dry ravel coming down the hill slopes. I think it was you that was mentioning dry ravel earlier. And what dry ravel is if you look in this photo, you can see this kind of conical shape of just loose soil that has all come down the hillside. That's happening as the fires are burning. We've got a little diagram here. That dry soil is locked on the hillsides behind the vegetation. And once that vegetation burns, it just starts flowing down into the stream channel, modifying the habitat even before we start seeing things like debris flow. Next slide, please. The other thing that we often do in U.S. Geological Surveys is we have geophysicists, and we send some geophysicists out to look at the ash and fire impacts immediately after these fires. And I think one of the really frightening things is in this graph of their results, the two wildland white ash, which are the two stars in the graph on the right-hand side of the graph, those are comparable to lye and liquid drain cleaner. So as the ash is falling on the waters and streams in these areas, that's kind of the effect that it's having on the water chemistry in these areas. And then that has a continuing effect on wildlife. Next slide, please. And so I think somebody in the questions asked, well, what happens to the wildlife in a fire? And here's an example of what happens to wildlife in a fire. These are fish that we found. I think this was the Santiago fire. But even as the fire is burning and we're out there looking at these sites, the fish in the creek are already dying from the chemical changes to the water, the ash falling on the water. And so it really is, the impacts to wildlife is immediate. So not even just the animals that are directly killed by the fire, but even adjacent to the fire where ash is falling, we see dramatic impacts on the wildlife. Next slide. And so for the Bobcat fire, where we had the mountain yellow-legged frog sites, Sue Cannon again worked up the debris flow risk models, and that's in the bottom right. Little Rock Creek, where the yellow-legged frogs are at, was predicted to have the risk of 10,000 to 100,000 cubic meters of debris flow based on the rainfall level. And so in advance of that, we set out to do an emergency salvage on the mountain yellow-legged frogs from this site. Little Rock Creek, if you look in the map at the top, it's straight from the top center, it says Little Rock Creek and points down to there. So that's the area that we're talking about here. And then of course, there's a picture of a yellow-legged frog in case you're not familiar with them. Next slide, please. And so we went in and did the emergency salvage. This is Little Rock Creek. The points in red are where we were able to collect 15 adult frogs, and then the points in yellow are where we collected 50 first-year tadpoles. And at the bottom, you can kind of see what the habitat looks like after it's been burned. And so those are relatively small pools. And if you imagine 10,000 to 100,000 cubic meters of debris flowing through here, all that habitat is going to be lost. We gathered up the animals and we were able to hike them out in these very fancy backpacks. They're insulated and temperature regulated, and there's basically, it's a cooler on a backpack. And so we were able to hike the animals out in that. Next slide. And so here you can see our field crews catching the yellow-legged frogs. Those pools would just, those are not going to take any kind of amount of debris to fill in. So like Ed was showing, those pools are going to fill in pretty quickly. Next slide, please. And so we took them to a stream that was outside of the Bobcat fire footprint. This is Alder Gulch. And actually, I'm sorry, we didn't take everything there. We took the tadpoles to the Los Angeles Zoo to add to their captive breeding program. They already have some tadpoles there, and this is just helping to add to their genetic diversity of that population. And then the 15 adults we took and relocated to Alder Creek. And at the bottom right, you can see them in their little transportation coolers. They're sitting in the water to kind of get temperature adjusted before we release them. But this is a much nicer habitat for frogs. You can see there's lots of cover, nice, beautiful greenery all around them. And so even before we see impacts to the habitat so before we see the debris flows, this is where we started moving these frogs. Next slide, please. And so just a little update. So that was the 2020 Bobcat fire. So far, we haven't seen debris flows in there, but that's also potentially because there wasn't a whole lot of rain. Most of the winter precipitation for 2020 was in the form of snow, which is more gradually let into the system and doesn't cause those huge amounts of debris flow. And so the animals are at the zoo still in the breeding program. And then the 15 adults that we moved to Alder Gulch. Next slide, please. They actually really like it in Alder Gulch. The 15 adults that we have there have bred. There were eggs over the winter, and there are now yellow-legged frog adults and tadpoles in Alder Gulch. We haven't been back in yet to do much more checking on these this year because the forest is closed, but hopefully they're doing well still. And it's one of the nice things to be able to do is help protect these endangered species. Next slide. All right, thank you very much for having me. That's the end of the talk, but not the end of the frogs.
Thank you so much. I'm going to have to start thinking of USGS and the ecological researchers as first responders and not just researchers.
Well, that was definitely part of our learning curve. Is like at 2003, we went out the following spring and it was like, okay, well, this is already too late. And so, we progressively got more and more in front of the impacts of the fire.
Great. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So our next presenter is Kendall Calhoun, who's a PhD candidate, University of California, Berkeley, talking about monitoring after the Mendocino complex fire.
Right. Thank you. And thank you all for having me. We can go to the next slide and just jump right in. So we've already talked a little bit about how wildlife are responding potentially to some of the wildfires happening in California. And I wanted to kind of jump in directly into some of what I'm looking at, more so in Northern California, but I hope still relevant to some of this discussion across the state. So my study site is up in Northern California, Hopland, California. On the right is a picture of about 2 months following the Mendocino complex fire. When we're thinking about the impacts of these types of high severity fires on wildlife, what comes to my mind, at least initially, is how the conversion of canopy cover or even just habitat cover can directly impact the functioning of some of these species. So for example, in the left corner, I have a mountain lion on one of our trail cameras. And as some of you may know, mountain lions depend on cover to use for ambushing prey. And if the habitat is dramatically converted, like the picture on the right, it can make catching prey in some of these locations very difficult. And then following that, even longer term, severe wildfires and very large severe wildfires can cause permanent habitat change, as the first panel kind of alluded to, which can cause even longer term shifts in which species are able to use these types of habitats. And then I really like what Ed had mentioned in the first talk, in that when these habitats do convert or change, at least even in the short term, it can lead for many of these species to move out of their original spaces and like cohabitate spaces closer to humans, which can lead to increased conflict. You can imagine if coyotes and mountain lions aren't able to get their normal prey species in their normal home ranges, they might be looking more at livestock or other species that humans care more about in their like closer to urban settings. So these are all interconnected and very complex problems that we're constantly dealing with. Okay, next slide. So to situate us, my research site is, as I said, the Hopland Research and Extension Center, way up in Northern California. The fire that I'm looking at is the 2018 River Fire, which is actually part of the Mendocino Complex Fire, which at the time was the largest California wildfire recorded. But that was, I think it was surpassed the following year. So just exemplary of what is kind of happening with this escalation in fire size and severity across the state. And then if you look on this map on the left, these black dots correspond to our trail camera locations. And each of those sites are where we're monitoring biodiversity over like many years. So we started this camera grid in 2016, and we're continuing to collect data now. So we have a lot of pre-fire data and a lot of post-fire data that we can use to compare. And this picture on the right is one of the pictures of the fire that the trail camera took, I think, before it melted. Next slide. Okay, and also, so one of my main interests in this project was trying to characterize total community response or ecological community responses to this wildfire. And I hope to stack on top of our trail camera data information about birds and bat diversity and how those are changing within the burned areas of the study site. So as you may have seen in the map before, half of the habitat burned and half of the habitat was unburned. So we're using that as like a natural experiment to see how bird and bat populations in this study site are changing over time in response to the fire. And I'm in the middle of analyzing this data, but there's a lot of research in forested and conifer ecosystems that suggests that depending on their functional group, different bird species respond differently to wildfire. And in general, really large, severe fires actually decrease bird diversity in some of those conifer systems. And I'd be really interested to see what that kind of trend looks like in oak woodland / shrubland systems as well. And then if we're thinking about bats, especially in oak woodland, scrubland habitats, bats play a really big ecosystem service in eating bugs and other insects, where people are, at least in Mendocino County, it's like surrounded by vineyards, where having that ecosystem service of insectivory is like key to a lot of those vineyards and agricultural success on a lot of those rangelands. Okay, next slide. And then thinking specifically about the camera traps, for those of you who don't know, they're trail cameras that take pictures of wildlife as they pass by or by heat triggering. We have 36 cameras across the site, which is about 3,500 acres. And then, as I said before, we have pre and post fire information to compare some of this. So for the end of this, I kind of wanted to give 2 case study examples. So we can go to the next slide. So this is an example of what kind of the visualization of some of this data looks like. So on the left, we have the total number of detections across all cameras for just coyotes. So in the red, we see all the numbers of coyotes we detect on our burned cameras. And in the blue, we have our unburned cameras. And you can see this red line, the red dashed line, is the date of the fire. So immediately following the fire, there's a huge spike in the number of detections of coyotes that we get on our cameras. And I should be clear that this doesn't necessarily have to do with like population number or anything. It has more to do with like activity at those sites. So potentially coyotes are way more active following wildfire in these areas. It could mean that they're moving around more because the habitat is like different and their way they navigate space has changed dramatically. or it could mean that perhaps prey is easier to find without there being a lot of cover, so they're more active in obtaining that prey. Okay, next slide. And then kind of as a contrast to that, we can look at a different species. So this is squirrel, specifically gray squirrel, and same kind of setup with the figure on the left. But instead of spiking, we see that gray squirrel activity is actually, oh, it says, I don't know if you can hear me well. I can try to take the mic out. Okay. Instead of gray squirrel activity spiking like coyotes, it actually drops very low in the burn cameras. And it's nice that we have these unburned cameras to compare between the burned and unburned sites. So, and furthermore, we can actually see over time whether or not these squirrel detections actually improve to the level that they were before the fire even happened. So yeah, I think it's, yeah, we can go to the next slide. I just wanted to end by saying that these effects are still kind of the short-term impacts of this wildfire, and that in systems like Woodlands and in chaparral regions, a lot of the impacts will be continued to be seen for many, many years because they take a long time to recover back to the stage or back to like pre-fire conditions. And which is why I think it's important to have these kind of monitoring efforts in these types of systems happening over long term, so we can see how these populations are actually able to respond and hopefully recover. And if not, you know, use some of the management tools we've talked about before to make sure that they are able to continue to use those spaces. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kendall. And just as you go forward, the mic out was much better. So keep it that way as we head into the Q&A. We'll take the next slide here. So moving on, we have Dr. Megan Jennings from San Diego State University, connecting wildlands, wildfire, and communities, planning for wildfire and climate resilience in Southern California. So welcome, Megan.
Thank you. So that was, hopefully you can hear me, yeah?
Yep.
Okay, great. That was a great setup by Kendall, and I'm going to take you from wildlife and fire to climate change and planning for all of these things. So next slide, please. All right. So I became interested in fire from working on the ground in land and fire management, and I took that into my graduate work. So we've heard a little bit about, you know, how survival and recolonization at the population level happens in fire in Southern California, after fire in Southern California for different species or entire communities. But after the 2003 fires, I really wanted to look deeper to understand how fire affects individuals through changes to habitat and resources. So a little bit of what Kendall hinted at. I focused my graduate research on carnivores because they're big enough to track, and looked at their response to fire at the landscape scale. So specifically habitat use and movement as the landscape recovers. So from that initial work, I found some things that weren't surprising, like the photo there that coyotes prefer burned habitat in the first few years after fire. They're adaptable, opportunistic, they jump on that chance. Mountain lions, they seem to follow deer that come to take advantage of the fresh growth. They want to browse on fresh growth in the first few growing seasons after fire, and the mountain lions follow them in those first sort of 2 to 5 years. But interestingly, bobcats generally avoid recently burned areas. Their prey species, rabbits and squirrels, again, Kendall pointed to that, they take longer to return to burned areas. And that has implications for bobcat habitat and their long-term persistence if the landscape's always in this early post-fire state. So next slide. So I thought more about the effects of shifting fire frequency and long-term impacts of vegetation type conversion on wildlife and habitats. And one of the things I found in looking at that is that for mountain lions, a species that's already at risk from urbanization, you know, where they have issues of getting from one large patch of suitable habitat to another because of all this urban landscape in between those patches. Increasing fire may further affect their persistence because they prefer shrublands to grasslands. Kendall talked about how they need that cover. So if the landscape is, again, changing to a grassland system, that can make it less suitable. And for bobcats and most likely other species, if we don't think about fire and vegetation type conversion, we might be overestimating connectivity throughout the landscape. So next slide. What do I mean by connectivity? Can you flip to the next slide, please? So what do I mean by connectivity? Well, that's how we think about and talk about the linkages between different parts of the landscape, different patches in the landscape. These can take lots of different forms, as you see on that graphic in the left. And in conservation planning, we often evaluate connectivity sort of more locally, thinking about connectivity between populations, specifically to protect things like threatened and endangered species. But also we do it at the landscape scale to make sure we have connections between ecosystems and natural communities, especially in these urbanized environments that are highly fragmented. But connectivity can also play a role in helping species survive under dynamic conditions like wildfire and climate change. But we have to be proactive about it. There's an opportunity cost if we don't plan for that in advance. So next slide. Oops, here we go. So several years ago, in partnership with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, glad to see Ed here, Erin, Conlisk, and I, she's going to talk next, initiated the Climate Resilient Connectivity Project to really explore those dynamics and think about connectivity under climate change for the region's diverse habitat types. You see some of those represented on the right-hand side of the slide, using a suite of different techniques, as well as some target species that we modeled connectivity for, and you can see those species also pictured on the right. And this is the map that came from that work that can be used in conservation planning to really support proactive planning for adapting to climate change for a range of species. And in fact, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, as well as some other conservation efforts, are already using this map and this data to support planning in their work that's already ongoing. And that's great. We already had some connectivity mapping, but this really put that climate change piece at the forefront so we could be thinking in advance. As part of this work, we generated some population models so we could evaluate the benefit of connectivity under climate change at the population level. And if you could flip to the next slide, you'll see that because we wanted to know how the linkage network may support wildlife populations after fires, Erin also evaluated the connectivity benefit to California spotted owls after fire, using that species as an example. And in that analysis, she found that the benefit of key linkages, those ones you see the 3 different colors for on the right-hand side there, it was greater with fire disturbance, not substantially, but you can see that there's a slight increase in those bars on the right-hand side of the graph. But we can think even more broadly about the potential benefits of connectivity beyond conserving just species or biodiversity. So next slide. And that connectivity project really got me thinking about how connectivity can play a role in helping our communities adapt to climate change. Our wildlands and our communities are inherently connected, but that's often not reflected in planning, as we've been hearing about today. So my colleague at San Diego State University, Becca Lewison, and I, we envisioned this Connecting Wildlands and Communities project, or CWC project, to build onto our connectivity and conservation work to help bridge that gap in planning for resilience in our wildlands and our communities. And over the last 3 years, we've worked in collaboration with our colleagues at the Climate Science Alliance, bringing together a team of researchers to work on these issues in collaboration with jurisdictional planners at the local and regional level, in addition to the usual suspects of folks we work with in natural resource management and conservation planning. Next slide. So our research teams have been focusing on developing the research and data products that you see listed on the screen. We can drop some links in so you can visit and explore the data. But what we've been really focusing on is how can we plan to reduce fire risk, promote water sustainability, and respond to climate extremes that benefit in a way that benefits both wildlands and communities in the region. So Erin's going to talk a little bit more about some of the work from our fire team, and Alex Syphard was part of that as well. And the research and data we're producing will be widely and publicly available. And it's already being used to do things like create some fire smart growth scenarios, something that's really needed, as we've heard earlier today, strategic planning for conservation, recreation, and really in particular climate adaptation planning by cities, counties, and importantly, tribal nations as well. We have some important tribal partners. Next slide. And this is important because the majority of planners that we've spoken to and worked with on this project, they told us that they really do want new tools and data. They are trying to address biodiversity, wildfire, and water sustainability in their planning for our communities. But funding, data availability, and ease of use are limiting. And they need data to support policy changes too, as we've been talking about earlier today. So we've focused on working with these partners to develop data and tools that are accessible, that are easy to use. Next slide. And so that takes me to the last piece, which is, we've actually had a lot of success thus far, and the project's not even quite done in building capacity and cross-sector partnerships to put our data to use. So we're working closely with several jurisdictions to help them integrate this data into their plans and decision tools and decision making. We're using the data to help with a resilient restoration project to support our tribal partners in their efforts to combine Western science with Indigenous knowledge to protect and restore culturally important plant species. And we're also leveraging the data to think, and as well as our partner networks and outreach efforts to support the development of a conservation strategy for our high elevation forests in Southern California. Hugh talked about this earlier, and we're working on this together. And all of these projects include important connections between wildlands, wildlife, wildfire, and communities. And we're really continuing to look for opportunities to leverage our research and partnerships to grow that work, because ultimately, we're more likely to be successful in our conservation and climate adaptation efforts by working together. So that's what I have for you today. Thanks.
Thank you, Megan. So we'll take the next slide. We'll follow on the overall project theme here with Erin Conlisk from Point Blue Conservation Sciences, Connectivity Under Fire, Assessing Impacts of Wildfire and Climate Change on Southern California Landscape. So welcome, Erin.
Thank you. We'll just jump right in. Next slide, please. As Megan just discussed, we were interested in climate resilient connectivity. And so I'm going to be doing sort of stepping back and looking at a landscape level assessment of can we identify the habitat and also the connectivity that will support these focal species and the landscapes that maintain them. So the resulting network that we developed is seen here, and you can see in dark the conserved areas, and in the light green and purple we have the focal linkages identified in the climate resilient connectivity work that we did. If you're familiar with Southern California, you know that these dark green areas are sort of higher elevation areas, consistent with sort of global patterns of conserved areas. So next slide, please. So our goal was climate resilience, but we were also interested in whether that network, right, it's meant to support much of our flora and fauna in Southern California, whether it was resilient to multiple stressors. And top on our list was wildfire. So I'm going to go through some spatial analyses listed on the left, but I really want to stress that this is teamwork, and I'm going to be presenting output from the Connecting Wildlands and Communities Team Fire. And this is a group led by Doug Stowe at SDSU, collaborator Alex Syphard, and spearheaded by Megan, who just spoke. So next slide, please. So here what I'm showing is a representation of fire history within the region. And I'm overlaying those conserved areas in dark hashing and the linkage areas in light gray stippling. And the metric I'm using of fire history within the region is back-to-back fires. And I define that as any area that's had 2 fires within a 15-year period. And I choose 15 years. In part, I'm going to describe some work by one of our postdocs showing that, by after 15 years, much of the chaparral canopy cover recovers after a fire. However, in high elevation forests, 15 years is rather a long time to go without seeing 2 fires or back-to-back fires. And you can see the pattern here of the linkage areas having more back-to-back fires. Next slide, please. You can see that the linkage areas are having them more frequently than the areas where historically they have occurred, which would be those high elevation areas. Next slide, please. And we can compare that to, Hugh said it was shown too often. I love the fire return interval departure map, but you can see that these areas where we see more frequent back-to-back fires, that is not what was happening historically. And at high elevation, we're seeing too infrequent fire. So next slide, please. So with more fire, we expected, thanks to much of the earlier talks today, we expect to see conversion of shrublands to herbaceous cover. And so SDSU graduate student Krista West tackled this problem using the rangeland analysis platform, which is a platform that looks at wall-to-wall vegetation going back to the 1980s using remote sensing and ground truthing. And so what I'm showing here, and this will be the same for the next slide as well, right, is the region on the left and then a zoomed in portion of the region on the right. And so what we see is herbaceous cover is happening throughout the region. It's really happening in areas of human impact. So adjacent to roads, some evidence of fires, but really throughout, not the clear, not as dramatic a pattern as we saw in the previous slide. Next slide, please. So what about those shrubs? And there's multiple stressors. So looking, postdoc Manny Story looked at chaparral recovery. Well, he looked actually at chaparral cover through time, focusing on areas that had fire versus, he's focusing on areas before fire and then after fire. And what he found was that, you know, these recovery rates or the amount of recovery were influenced by climate variables. And so he could use that to project across the entire region. And so here he's showing areas of higher chaparral sensitivity to drought. And again, these are scattered throughout all of the Southern California region, and they're occurring really on the rain shadows of our mountains. So in our eastern borders. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's two stressors, right? Climate and fire, but there's other stressors on the Southern California landscape. And so postdoc Isabel Rojas Viada looked at what we're calling multiple domains of refugia. So, you know, where the landscape is resilient to climate, wildfire, water, and recreation pressure. And you can see those areas on the left side of the map where the darker the area, the more resilient it is to each of those stressors. And those these maps are sort of amalgamations of the multiple metrics listed on the right. And you can roll them up, next slide, please, to show this green map on the left, where again, the darker areas are areas of higher refugial value. And looking at these areas, contiguous areas of high refugial value, we see they're clustered in the northwest and the southeast in what we call super refugia. And they are occurring both in conserved areas and in linkage areas. And there's stepping stones throughout the region, small patches of refugia to move between these areas. So, you know, going forward, preserving both these linkage areas as well as the conserved areas is important for multiple stressors on the Southern California landscape. And I just also want to say that this paper, not only is the analysis great, but the introduction provides really good background on refugia. So I highly recommend looking at that one. Next slide, please. So this work is ongoing and there's still more products being produced. The water resilience maps, recreational refugia, and if you want to look at more reports, papers, story maps, and arts, there's the links there to the Climate Resilient Connectivity Network and the Connecting Wildlands and Community project. There's also original art there, and I'd like to just thank our funders, Fish and Wildlife, WCB, and the Strategic Growth Council. So thank you.
Thank you. Sorry to leave you hanging there. I had muted so that I wouldn't interrupt you, and there I go. Yeah, these talks are like drinking from a fire hose because we get so much so fast. It's wonderful. So we'll go here into a little bit of a panel discussion to be able to think a little more deeply, ask some questions, maybe do some sipping as opposed to gulping with the content. Can we get switched to so that the slides down and we're all on the screen so I can see everybody and everybody can see us? Perfect. So thank you, first of all, for a bunch of really interesting presentations with a lot of content. And I wanted to sort of start one place, which is I didn't hear, or I'm not sure that we necessarily as a community always do as good a job as we should at recognizing what the baseline is prior to the period that we have a lot of data for, which is a landscape that was occupied and not just occupied, lived on. People lived their lives on for about 9,000 years, give or take, and managed the landscape presumably for wildlife. And so I just want to sort of pose to the group as a whole, what your thoughts are about fire relative to wildlife and the indigenously managed landscape that basically sculpted what we have prior to its calification during the Rancho period. Is there anybody who wants to sort of think about that a little bit? Because I think we, especially historical ecology, I do a lot of historical ecology work, we maybe traditionally haven't done as, well, not maybe, we haven't done as good a job, I think, as we should in understanding that and what it means. I know, Megan, you mentioned a little bit about your native partners in the mountain areas, but I just want to open that up for whoever would like to start. Maybe, Megan, I'll pick on you since you mentioned it.
Sure, I'd be happy to talk more about that. So we work really closely with the Climate Science Alliance's Tribal Working Group, which is a group of over 20 tribal partners, across Southern California. And it's been a great learning opportunity to really think about that history of Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous stewardship. And you're absolutely right. I mean, and, in Hugh's talk, he started by saying, pre-Euro-American settlement, that we had a totally different environment that was not hands-off. It was very actively managed by the original stewards of this land, the Indigenous people who were here. And, fire was a tool that they used very frequently. And we talk about how the mountain landscapes have changed and, both in terms of fire frequency, but in terms of what the habitat looked like for wildlife. I think, in those montane environments, it was very different, probably more open. And you think about, I worry about things like spotted owls, where the forests have become too dense and we're having stand replacing wildfire and they're losing habitat. The chaparral is a little harder to puzzle out, but even with them actively burning, and we talk a lot about this with them where, we want to return to the old ways and burn in the chaparral again, because their ability to burn has been greatly restricted. And we talk about that, and I say my concern is the old ways happened before there were 25 million people here, starting fires left and right. So yeah, they talk a lot about, my tribal partners talk a lot about what things used to look like and wildlife that are important, plants that are important. And I'm still trying to puzzle out exactly what that looked like in the chaparral systems, where I know fire was a frequent visitor, but there's no way it was as frequent as it is now, because there just weren't even with them actively managing with fire, there's no way they were putting as much fire on the ground in chaparral as we are now.
That's a really important point. Ed, you're nodding your head.
No, I was just saying, I'm glad Megan answered that question. I'm no expert in that area, just besides what I've read out of my own curiosity. And yeah, what Megan mentioned is exactly my understanding as well, and Hugh as well.
Great. So to switch it up, so I had another question here that I think is on everybody's mind, and it's for Kendall. And the question is this. Are squirrels an indicator of fire risk, or is there something really different about one half of the preserve than the other that had all those squirrels that got hammered? So squirrels are on people's minds out there, and we'd like to know what's going on.
Yeah, so I did answer one of these questions already on the chat, but
okay. So
I should start out by saying that part of that result is a fact that the fire didn't burn exactly half of the cameras. So 25 of those cameras are in the burn area and 11 are unburned. So we would expect that because there's more cameras in the burn area, we should be getting more squirrel detections in those. But I think because of that, it's even more dramatic that we see that after the fire, we get just as many detection of squirrels in that larger burn area as we get in the smaller unburned area. And I don't know if well, I mean, maybe potentially squirrels could be an indicator of like fire. Maybe like there might be a point at which severity is at a point in oak woodlands where squirrels can't use those areas anymore. I don't know, potentially, like in future analyses, I could try to pinpoint that. But in terms of fire risk, I'm not as sure. Did I answer? Was that the
Yeah,
question?
no, I think, look, it was one of those things I think was on everybody's mind and deserved a little more explanation. So we did, because, you know,
Yeah.
squirrels, right?
I'll also say that, yeah, kind of also from what we expected, smaller animals are less able to, you know, escape the acute effects of the fire, like as it's happening. So, and they also take longer to recolonize those sites because they move less or less far. So
perfect segue, because I think one of the things that was really striking about Carlton's presentation is that the fish are out there dying in the middle of the fire. And I think people have this sort of maybe Hollywood sense that when there's a fire, all the animals get up and move away and, you know, they go somewhere else and whatnot. Can we just all just go through and say, what happens to birds, herps, mammals, insects, fish during a fire in that footprint? Live, die, escape, and maybe start, you know, Erin and Megan, you've done some of the bigger sort of connectivity work. From mountain lions down to gobies. Let's go around the panel. What happens to these? Are they killed? They get away? What's the deal?
I'll go ahead and jump on that first. Erin actually dropped a chapter that I wrote on faunal diversity and chaparral in the chat earlier, because that question came up on the Q&A. And, you know, it depends both on the species, how mobile they are, but also what their habits are. So things that burrow underground can sometimes escape the fire. But, you know, I've worked post-fire a lot during fires, and you know, seen snakes partially burned, you know, even gophers that are underground burned, rabbits burned, you know, so it definitely, and the whole mountain lion burn pads, the stuff Ed talked about, happens to bobcats. They have singed airways. So a lot of immediate effects, but you know, if those animals can move and escape, birds, again, depends on how much they fly. You know, some birds flit from bush to bush and some can really make larger movements. And so all of that's going to depend on how hard those populations are hit. And then how fast they recover depends on what they need. You know, kangaroo rats love post-fire environment because it's all open and they can hop around and do their cute thing, and they come back more quickly. Wood rats are hit super hard and it takes a long time for them to come back. So again, it just depends on sort of how they can shelter during the fire and then what they need after the fire.
Who wants to add? Carlton? Yeah.
I was gonna say, I think a lot of it also depends on the time of year and the animal's behavior at that time of year. So like for a lot of reptiles and amphibians and things like that, if it's during the hottest part of the summer, they're underground or in protected places already when the fire comes past. And they may just come back out and find a really sucky world that's not suitable for them. So they may not die immediately, but then that secondary or tertiary impact may be what takes them down. I've seen, you know, like Megan was saying, I've gone to fires and seen like live rattlesnakes crawling on the surface right after a fire. I've gone to fires and found lots of barbecued rattlesnakes. One of the recent controlled fires I was at, the fire's burning, and then after it passes, I'm, you know, on a hilltop scanning it through my binoculars, and it's like there's a long-tailed weasel popping up out of a burrow, just looking around going, what just happened here? You know, so it's really variable as to what happens for these animals. But kind of like what I was trying to show in my presentation, it's not always about what happens immediately. You know, there's what happens over the winter, and then there's what happens over the, you know, when we finally do get precipitation. And if that gets blown out and all their habitat's gone, that's really different. So it's really, I think the key word is variable. That's just, you know, it really depends on, you know, 5, 6, 7, 10 different factors.
Well, and given that, Erin, did you want to hop in there? Yeah.
Well, I was going to say conceptually, just stepping back and conceptually what everybody's talking about is time, right? So it's the time of the fire, it's the rate of the of movement compared to the rate of the fire moving, compared to the rate of these other stressors. I mean, then there's climate change on top of this. And again, when we think about climate change, we need to think about the rate of these animal movements, as well as the changing of their habitat. And the rate of regeneration times, right? So it's going to be very different if your regeneration time for the organism is a year or less versus organisms that can live multiple years, and maybe they can have a reproductive hit in 1 or 2 years post-fire and then recover. So everything is a rate. So if I can just step back conceptually with all of the specific taxa knowledge and sort of what we're talking about is time.
I feel like there's a model in there somewhere.
I was going to say that, just if I could add to that, the other factor, at least when it comes to aquatic species, and Carlton, may know more about this than I do, but of course, the next year's precipitation, if it's low and those waters remain perennial, so if the water chemistry is not too bad, those animals can survive. So that's really, really important. And maybe the vegetation can grow back to a point where you're not going to have the soil movement like you would immediately after. That's a factor. Also, the extent of the fire. If the fire just goes through part of a watershed and there's still habitat upstream, those waters can be reinvaded by those individuals upstream. So it really depends on those kind of factors as well for aquatic species anyway.
And so continuing on that, then what are the roles of different landscape features as refugia during fire, like riparian zones and whatnot? Maybe Kendall, you've seen some of that in your different habitats.
Yeah, still kind of looking at some of these analyses, but it looks like specifically for, I think it's like deer, coyote, and bobcat in our study, directly after the fire, all of those species are very strongly selecting for areas that have at least some canopy cover following the fire. So yeah, I've been comparing like how habitat selection for those species has changed over years, before the fire and after the fire. And initially, or apparently the year of the actual event of the fire, those groups of species are more strongly selecting for the standing vegetation. And we also have some collar data on deer during the fire event that also suggests that deer are moving quickly through very burned, like high severity landscapes that don't have any canopy cover, and like foraging and resting in areas that do have cover that are remaining. So yeah.
Thank you. So to link this back to a conversation earlier today about fuel breaks and like wildland fuel breaks, and some of the discussion about them being ineffective, well, at least I won't editorialize. What are the benefits and harms of wildland fuel breaks, conversion of chaparral to annuals, basically across ridge lines, et cetera, for wildlife?
All right, I'm gonna jump on this bomb for everybody. So for anyone who doesn't know, I worked for the National Forest Service for over a decade, and I spent a lot of time, I was a wildlife biologist, but I spent a lot of time working on fuels reduction projects and fire management projects as somebody advocating for resources. And I will say, I really can't argue that there's much of any benefit of a fuel break for wildlife. However, the real benefit and the real goal of those fuel breaks is to provide a strategic suppression opportunities and fire safe opportunities for firefighters to engage. So that's all about firefighter safety. And so the way we would talk about them is, are you going to put somebody on the ground there to fight the fire? Are you strategically deploying resources? If so, then there may be value there. If there's not, we should not be creating it. A fuel break on its own does not stop a fire. You have to have resources on the ground. And I would always argue that if you cannot tell me that you're going to put somebody there, then we should not be doing it, because there is an ecological impact that we cannot sustain if there's not a very strong justification for why we're doing it and where we're doing it.
Was that, just a second, Ed, was that position well received by the Forest Service?
Yeah. I mean, as Hugh said earlier today, I came in, I worked on the Cleveland National Forest, and I came in during a time of sort of cultural and institutional change and a greater acceptance of the science. And I always advocated using the science, and that was well received, and had very good relationships with fire managers where we could figure out this give and take, because it is absolutely a give and take.
Yeah, thanks. Because Ed, I was going to ask you, you have the resources of the state of California as your trust, right, that you represent for us. What's the role of Cal Fish and Wildlife in ensuring that the wildlife is protected in the process of people trying to follow the science or not follow the science, as the case may be in individual jurisdictions on fire management?
Yeah, Megan's answer was dead on. We try to evaluate where having fire breaks and actually, fuel reduction can potentially have small, impacts, but may have larger benefits if we can actually prevent fire from spreading to these massive areas that we've seen in the past. So there's that. And then the other thing that I was going to mention was, sort of an ancillary problem associated with opening these areas up to roads and things like that, is that, we have recreational activities that occur, and it used to be off-road vehicles. We've got that better under control these days, but with, mountain biking and e-bikes and things like that these days, that creates a huge problem for us. And I'll just say, it's not all mountain bikers, but on our lands, mountain bikers get out of control. It's maybe a small percentage of the mountain bikers that go out and make illegal trails, and then other bikers use them. And pretty soon you got a spider web of trails all over the landscape that are all illegal, and everyone's using them. So that's another real impact. And so that creates not only direct impacts and indirect impacts on wildlife, but also, you have, like was talked about earlier, the spread of invasive species, weeds and things like that. So that is in my view, a real problem with creating those types of openings where they may not be necessary. Where they're necessary, okay. But then to really control that, we need a lot of enforcement, and no one has that available. We don't have enough enforcement, and nor does anyone else. So that's just kind of an interesting side note of that issue.
Does that mean we should change our language about these features and stop calling them fuel breaks and start calling them, firefighter access and safety zones, so that it's clear what we're doing isn't trying to stop a fire? Because people have the essential idea that they think they're fire breaks and whatnot. That's what's going to stop the fire. And when it's not, in many instances, especially in windblown Southern California mega fires, it's gonna protect us. Can we pass a resolution here to change the name of fuel breaks? We good? Okay, so we deliver results in this panel. I see Eileen, which means we must be getting to the end of our time. I hear a second from the audience. I think it's unanimous. So no more fuel breaks. They're firefighter access zones. So it's very clear that that's what they're for. My job is done. Thank you so much, panel.
Thank you, Travis. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Travis. Boy, you really drive an outcome there, don't you? Thanks very much.
Lots of experience.
I appreciate the work here. And so I want to thank you and thank all the panelists that we just heard from, and thank all the panelists for the day as we head into our poster session. So we're going to have a lunchtime poster session. And before I do that, I just want to thank everybody for attending today. I'm going to turn things over to Drew Reedy, but I did want to personally thank everybody for participating today, the panel members, the moderators. Certainly, I want to thank the sponsors for helping to support such a great event and to have all of this really important information. in front of all of this, in front of all of us, and also look forward to the third session on October 14th. I also want to thank Eileen and her staff who helped plan for all of this. And I'm going to now turn it over to Drew Reedy, who will handle the poster session moderation. And I believe he will do that starting in about 5 minutes, but I'll turn it over to Drew right now.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. And thank you, Travis and Sabrina and all the panelists we've had so far today. I do think we'll take this opportunity to just take a couple minute break. So people that have some lunch or a snack handy can grab that and do what you need to do and meet back here at noon to get our poster presentations moving. Thank you all again. Thank you, Steve. I know you have to duck out now. You did a great job pulling this all together for us throughout the day. We will see you all in a couple minutes.
Hey, Drew, I just also wanted to add my thanks to all of our, to both of our moderators and our panelists, and certainly to you and Elise and to Steve and to Mark for starting this off today. Looking forward to the poster sessions in a few minutes.
Great. See everybody back. Appreciate it. Okay, Eileen, I think we could get started.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to mention to our poster session folks, I'm not going to be able to stay on to the very end. So I'm going to look forward to seeing the recordings of those I'm going to miss, but I appreciate all of you taking the time and effort to put together some great presentations, and looking forward to hearing these in the next few minutes. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Eileen. And thank you all for sticking with us in what's been a very full day. We'll have 6 short presentations today, maybe 5. We're not sure about our last presentation, but which may give us some more time for Q&A. We'll be recording questions, and anything that doesn't get answered will be forwarded to our presenters to answer after today's event. And the results will be posted. Eileen, you can go to the next slide really quick. And after all the presentations, I'm going to ask some poster presenters here, so I hope you're all listening, to kick off our Q&A with a question for one of your fellow panelists. We did this last time, and it was a great way to get the discussion moving. So we hope that you're all listening here and that you'll help us with that. We do have some questions for each of you, but we are hoping you'll ask some questions of each other. So let's get started. I think I'll start sharing my screen, and we'll start with Sarah Kevorkian with the Santa Monica Mountains, who is the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy Regional Forest and Fire Capacity Project Manager. And I thought I had a long title, with the MRCA, the Mountains Recreation Conservation Authority. And Sarah, can you share your screen and give us your slides? There you go. Great. Perfect. And you're welcome to get started as soon as you're ready.
Thank you so much. All right. Hey everyone, my name is Sarah Kevorkian. I'm with the Mountains Recreation and Conservation Authority, or MRCA. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about an MRCA project where we're planting trees to prevent the next Woolsey fire. I'll be discussing a few components of the project, and I'll start with the fire history that led to this project. In 2018, the Woolsey fire started in the Simi Hills, after which it jumped the 101 freeway and spread to a large area of the Santa Monica Mountains. This is the 4-mile stretch of the 101 freeway where the fire jumped from one side to the other. And actually, let's take a look at what that area looks like. So as you can see, the freeway acts as an over 150-foot wide concrete fuel break, if you will. But unfortunately, due to the Santa Ana wind-driven fires here, the fire is able to jump from one side, depositing embers to the other. And this 4-mile section of the freeway is actually the exact project location I'll be talking about today. All right. So this project consists of removing flashy, non-native weeds, and in its place, we'll be planting coast live oaks and valley oaks. Here is the project area. And again, this is that same critical 4-mile section of the 101 freeway. And here you'll see the MRCA managed public lands in green, and the strategic placement of the trees are shown here as well. All right, so why oaks? So native oaks have adapted to become resistant to fires. They have the ability to act as an ember buffer or screen during the Santa Ana wind-driven fires. The project will have various benefits, including protecting communities and ecosystems. We'll be improving air quality and increasing carbon sequestration year-round. We're planting trees, right? And the trees will also create habitat and ultimately All these benefits will work together to help increase climate resiliency. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the MRCA and our role in this project. As a background, the MRCA is a joint powers authority. We are comprised of the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy, as well as 2 local park districts. And we've been preventing and responding to wildfire since 1985 when we were created. Our unique joint powers authority makeup allows us to have our own rangers. We have a fire division with firefighters, patrols on red flag days when there's high fire risk, as well as different teams of experts that support us. But the reason that the MRCA is so integral to this project is because we manage the very strategic public lands along that 4-mile section of the 101 freeway. And this map actually shows the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy Zone, with the red being the very high fire hazard severity zones, and the green are the public lands that the MRCA manages. So we're very busy, if you can't tell. And a really important component of what we do at the MRCA is coordinating with other agencies and land managers, which I'll be talking about in this next section. So most of you are probably familiar with the Regional Forest and Fire Capacity, or RFFC program. It's a statewide effort to increase regional capacity, to prioritize, develop, and implement projects to improve fire resiliency. And the SMMC is a block grantee of the RFFC program, and the MRCA is helping support that regional effort. So we're coordinating on a statewide level with the Department of Conservation, Natural Resources Agency, also other block grantees throughout the state. But most importantly, we're collaborating with local partner agencies, tribes, and resource conservation districts to prioritize shovel-ready projects. We'll also be completing a regional priority plan and demonstration projects, one of which is this 101 Freeway Fire Corridor project. So this project is definitely in sync with the larger RFFC framework. And finally, workforce development is such an important component to not only this project, but other MRCA projects as well. This project wouldn't be able to succeed if it wasn't for local workforce development organizations and leadership. Here are a few folks we work with, and I think it's really empowering that there are community members helping mitigate fires. And with that, just to keep in mind, investing in more resilient, investing in our climate. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. And we're going to hold questions until after all the poster presenters have given their presentation. So we'll move on to Allison Ecker, planner and designer with the SWA group. Allison, are you able to share your slides?
Do you see my screen right now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So hey everybody, my name is Allison. I'm a designer and planner working with SWA Group in Sausalito. We're a landscape architecture, planning, and urban design firm with 8 studios, including 4 in California. So as a firm, we engage in various large-scale wildfire planning and design projects. And what I wanted to share with you today is a recent speculative project that we engaged in through SWA's Excel Lab, which is our internal design, research, and innovation platform. So using Paradise and the campfire as a case study, we explored ideas about how to better design for wildfire in terms of developing large-scale wildfire buffer networks, designing interventions that embed multiple benefits to communities, And importantly for our work, creating visualizations that aim to inform, inspire, and really open up, debate and dialogue about what's possible. So it's likely needs little introduction here. In the fall of 2018, the campfire became the state's most deadly and destructive fire of all time, essentially wiping out the town of Paradise in a matter of hours. So today, the community is well along in its rebuilding efforts, with many agencies working hard to develop innovative mitigation strategies. And this includes the Paradise Recreation and Parks District, which has been heavily involved in this effort and guided us as we analyze and visualize landscape-based wildfire strategies. So an important part of our design research was working through ideas about how we could scale up the concept of defensible space from an individual parcel scale to the collective community scale. So what many people are likely familiar with is a diagram that looks something like that on the left, with zones of defense radiating out from a building footprint. Our diagram on the right proposes that if landowners instead work collectively, they'll be able to converge resources and goals. The concept starts with a protected community zone, densified and fortified from cyclical wildfires, a wildfire buffer zone where a menu of mitigation strategies are implemented in a network of patches and corridors, and then finally a natural burn zone, which recognizes that not all areas can as reasonably be protected from and managed for wildfires. So the next step was to take this spatial strategy and apply it to the Paradise region. The Paradise Parks Department and partners have done really great work developing this initial community wildfire buffer concept. So through this project, we explored how that initial concept could be creatively expanded, modified, or amended. So what we arrived at was this 90,000 acre network of overlapping corridors and patches. And this approach aims to simultaneously take into account varying habitat patches, which overlap with diverse land use patches and are connected by a network of man-made and natural corridors. The intention of this landscape mesh is to provide a significant degree of protection around Paradise and then create a long-term protective framework that might grow or change over time. So from this map, we then began to develop a series of typical multi-benefit mitigation approaches. We zoomed into various conditions across the landscape to identify the relationship between key existing risk factors and then propose mitigation strategies. So for example, looking at the very left, one of the most significant issues in Paradise and many similar areas are overgrown and high-risk utility corridors. So we then began to visualize how those corridors could be addressed through a multi-step mitigation and benefit approach. So for example, within these utility corridors, we propose that some combination of animal grazing and mechanical thinning can be employed alongside infrastructure upgrades and can ultimately contribute to maintenance of a new fuel break with trails for hiking and mountain biking. This strategy translates into a vision of a safer utility corridor with the added benefits of local recreation opportunities, adjacent shaded fuel breaks to provide habitat for migratory birds, sustainable revenue for timber sales, and parking lots for trail visitors, maintenance workers, and then, if necessary, fire crews in case of an emergency. So I'll flip through a few more visualizations, and these are just more or less like snapshots of ideas, and they're really just intended to open up thinking and conversations about how wildfire mitigation could be coupled with new community benefits. So for example, we looked at how a shrub patch could be converted to a community-owned orchard offering local produce, as well as a large-scale event areas for festivals and expos, and then that could double as an irrigated fire break. Or how a dense timber stand could be thinned to create a healthier and more productive stand. Broadcast burns could create a healthier understory, and therefore recreational opportunities such as an outdoors rope course could educate the public while also generating revenue. And then finally, how a forested community land could benefit from periodic pile burns to clear space for community campgrounds and therefore reduce the risk of destructive crown fires. So that's a really, quick high-level overview of the project. Thanks everybody for your time. Then I'm happy to take any questions at the end.
Great. Thank you, Allison. I suspect there'll be some great questions at the end here. Peggy Nguyen, are you with us? Can you join us?
I am.
Can you share your screen? Great.
Okay, can everyone see this? Can everyone see this poster? Drew, you're muted.
Yes, we can.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Peggy Nguyen. I am a doctoral candidate at the UCLA Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. And what I'm going to be presenting to you today is the result of two efforts that I made as part of my solutions course as part of that program. At the time, I was doing the project with the City of Los Angeles, LA Sanitation and Environment, and I was working on testing technology for conservation purposes. And what I ended up creating was a workflow for using GIS and machine learning together with ortho-rectified aerial photography or imagery that we have available to us through the LA Regional Imagery Acquisition Consortium that's at a scale of 10 centimeters ground sampling distance. I was able to develop a work plan for using tools to semi-automatically map invasive species using that imagery. So I'll be showing you how I did that. And I also, another thing that I was able to develop was a tool that allows you to enter your zip code and elevation to get a local climate adapted list of vegetation alliances with plant lists for each vegetation alliance that you could use to restore an area. So how is this significant for wildfire and wildfire management? The title of my poster, let me see if I can zoom in so I can see it a little better. I'm going to go out of this mode. Is basically ecological burn area emergency response. And what the tools are rapid remote invasive weed mapping and climate adapted local native plant palettes. So what is it that we need after a fire? Oftentimes we think of in our response of the protection of property, of homes and roads and land and whatnot. But one of the things that often is a concern is that invasive weeds begin to enter into a burn area. And what studies have shown is that the larger the burn area is, the less capable the area is to recover with native seeds alone by itself, and sometimes intervention is required. And so what our needs are is to manage and remove those invasive weeds, perhaps help with supplemental seeding, actively manage the invasive weeds. Another consideration is wildfire is potentially occurring because of local changes in microclimate. And so how do we select a supplemental seed bank or effort that is climate adapted? So tools are needed to help with making those science decisions. And then we also need the ability to empower community stewardship. And one of these is the ways that people can help is to help with invasive weed mapping. The California Invasive Plant Council now has a weed mapper app where we can input locations of weeds. And so this is almost, I guess, an effort to provide the tools for people who would like to help with that effort. We need to empower folks with invasive weed removal and prevention, observing and enforcing bans on specific types of invasive weeds. And then we need to help folks to help to restore and maintain habitat. Okay, I'm going to zoom into sections of this poster. Okay, so rapidly mapping pampas grass. What I did was I was asked to try my algorithm on student computers at UCLA. And so from testing it on that and finding limitations with the GIS software I was using, I determined the minimum system requirements, and those are on this poster: the graphics cards needed, the parallel computing capacity, and the minimum RAM needed on a computer. The software I used, I tested ArcGIS and NB, and I used Lariac 10 centimeter GSD imagery. And what I did was I researched existing efforts in remote mapping of invasive species and followed the methodology. Essentially, the way we mapped was we identified the spectral signature for the species. I selected invasive pampas grass because it's very easy to identify from aerial photography. And I ran the following workflow. First, I did an image segmentation using unsupervised classification. I was using ArcMap at the time. I did this twice with the hope to get 10 classes. And each time it refined my classification. These are right here, the pampas grass. You can see they're kind of pink, and then the shadow from the plumage forms this blue shadow right here. So it's very distinct. It almost looks like an elf. So I did that to segment the image to make it easier to classify. And then the next step is to choose the function that's used to further classify it. And this is just a demonstration of using maximum likelihood, support vector machine, or random trees machine learning algorithms. For this particular classification, I used maximum likelihood, but the better classification method is support vector machines and random trees. I just was not able to do that on a student computer. This is the result of the next step, which is classifier training. And the way you do this is you use the supervised classification method. And I was able to train the program to identify, just in pink here, you see the pampas grass in the scene over a number of just iterative training steps. And finally, to validate whether or not this particular workflow worked, I compared it against 2007 field sampling results, assuming that no work had been done to remove the plants. And so you see here, pampas grass mapped in 2007, and the similar location is here. So I was able to identify the locations remotely. I never went out into the field to check that, just by looking at aerial imagery. All right, the second tool that I would like to share with you is the native climate adapted native vegetation alliance selection tool. I looked at research on vegetation shifts from climate change and noticed that in this particular area that our vegetation is shifting upward in elevation. So I programmed a spreadsheet to use elevation data that I inputted from different vegetation alliances and shift it depending on which climate change scenario the user inputted. I only provided two options. One is a worst case scenario of 8.5, and 4.5 was the other option. And these are just representative of whether or not we're able to mitigate climate change. I also gave the option of different planning horizons, and I used the data from Alex Hall's 2018 climate change assessment report for the LA region for the calculations. The users to input the zip code and the elevation, and what happens next is the tool filters through the database of vegetation alliances for a given area. And here I've highlighted or circled in red, actually it's the image to the right here. Here I've highlighted in red from a list of vegetation alliances that the tool outputs, what it filters out when you enter the elevation. Okay, and so this is organized partly by ecotope, which is categories or of zones in the city that Isaac Brown had come up with based on microclimate, vegetation, and landform. But I took this list and I compared it to previous mapping, natural history data. I think from early 2000s. I'm actually not sure of the year. But if you look at these various habitats that are listed here, they are similar to the ones that the tool generated. So I feel very confident about the output from this tool. In addition to the vegetation alliances that it provides for a given area, it also gives lists of plants and where they typically occur, what kinds of soils and the locations. And then you click on the info link to get to Calscape, where you can check their occurrences to see if there are any historic occurrences in the area. And that is a simple and basic overview of the two tools that were developed. And I invite you to take a closer look at the poster when you have a chance. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Peggy. And now we have Kelsey. Kelsey, I'm going to butcher your last name. I will keep it a Kelsey. We have Kelsey next, presenting on plant health assessments and species recognition using drone technology. Kelsey.
Hi, everyone. Let me just share my screen. Okay, there we go. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I'll get started. My name is Kelsey Workington, and I will be presenting on plant health assessments and species recognition using drone technology and machine learning. This presentation is a part of a project I work on with my colleagues at HANA Resources. Okay. So one of our primary goals is to assess plant health and identify and aid in the removal of Arundo-Donax. So Arundo is this highly invasive giant reed that's pictured. It chokes out the native vegetation and it creates fire hazards due to its fuel load, rhizome, growth structure, and ignition sources. It has this tall and ventilated structure that allows fire to burn hotter and spread quickly. So in the aftermath of a fire event, Arundo quickly resprouts and grows at a rapid rate compared to the native plants. And this creates this positive feedback cycle that eliminates the large native rich riparian corridors that have historically served as natural fire breaks. So we conduct a plant health assessment and species recognition using our high resolution drone imagery. Okay, so this project is located in the Prado Basin near Corona. We flew transects to capture imagery and assess plant health for a multi-temporal analysis from 2018 to 2021. The imagery displayed is from our 2021 flight. So plant health values are derived using an NDVI dataset. The measured values range from -1 to +1, where -1 is equivalent to surface water, while +1 represents dense vegetation. And then in the middle, you'll get roads, dirt paths, building surfaces, typically closer to 0. So in December of 2020, a fire was ignited near the Corona Municipal Airport, approximately 1.25 miles east of this project transect. It was named the Airport Fire, and it quickly grew due to the strong winds in the Prado Basin. The fire burned uncontrolled for 12 days before it was 100% contained. So the Airport Fire consumed 1,087 acres of vegetation within the Prado Basin, including part of this transect in section 3 here. You can see in the bright orange area. So if we compare the data before and after the fire, we can see that the plant health data captured the immediate impact of the airport fire. Taking a closer look at section 3 here, we can compare the imagery from 2020 in 2021, as well as the NDVIs derived from this imagery. So the inanimate surfaces and dead vegetation areas increased sharply from 7.2% to 31.7% after the fire. The fire consumed forests of Arundo and eliminated areas of healthy and very healthy vegetation, with a reduction in these classifications from 82% to 59%. So another analysis we perform using the drone imagery is species recognition to identify the Arundo. So on the left here, you see the drone imagery and what Arundo would look like. So utilizing drones, HANA can capture the latest imagery of an area with precision and accuracy while producing high resolution products. So using a proprietary and patented process involving deep learning, specifically convolutional neural networks, we provide our clients with accurate Arundo acreages. So here we have the 2020 drone imagery with the Arundo species recognition overlaid. And here's the 2021 after the fire. So you see this large reduction of Arundo coverage after the fire. In conclusion, HANA can provide this replicable analysis to track trends in vegetation health and growth over time. Our clients are then empowered to make informed decisions about best management practices for native habitat restoration, fire prevention, and Arundo removal. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelsey. Next, we have Elizabeth Reed Wainscoat presenting Built to Burn, California's Wildlands Development and Playing with Fire. Kelsey's the senior scientist at the Urban Wildlands Center for Biological Diversity. Welcome.
Hi, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Thank you for having me. My name is Elizabeth Reed Wainscoat. I'm with the Center for Biological Diversity, and I'm presenting on a report that my colleague Tiffany Yap published earlier this year, Built to Burn. There we go. Okay. As we've heard from many presentations earlier today, wildfires ignited by lightning strikes and indigenous cultural burning have occurred on California's landscape for millennia. They're a natural and necessary process for many of California's ecosystems, but in the past 200 years since European colonization, poor land use planning and land management have shifted historical fire regimes, causing exceptional harm to communities and wildlife. Between 2015 and 2020, almost 200 people in the state were killed in wildfires, more than 50,000 structures burned, hundreds of thousands of people had to evacuate their homes and endure power outages, and millions were exposed to unhealthy levels of smoke and air pollution. So far this year, 3,503 structures have burned and 3 people have lost their lives to wildfire, and we are bracing ourselves for peak wildfire season right now. Impacts of wildfire disproportionately affect low-income and minority communities, especially Native American, Black, Latino, and Southeast Asian communities. Elderly, disabled, non-English speaking, and homeless community members are also marginalized. These groups often have fewer resources to safely evacuate, buy fire insurance, implement fire safety measures, or rebuild. They also have less access to disaster relief that can help subsidize some of the recovery costs. Health impacts from increased air pollution from fine particulates and wildfire smoke also disproportionately affect vulnerable populations, and these impacts extend far outside the boundary of the fire, making the case that preventing wildfires must be a regional goal rather than a localized issue. Shifts in California's historic fire regimes due to roads and poorly planned development have negative impacts on native ecosystems as well. Highly biodiverse chaparral is being converted to non-native grasses because they are burning too frequently. And isolated populations of sensitive wildlife like mountain lions, mountain yellow-legged frogs, and western pond turtles are suffering. While historically these species would have been able to recolonize from neighboring populations after the loss of individuals or populations to fire impacts, that ability is now limited by the species' current small and fragmented population structure. So how did we get here? Science clearly shows that where we place homes influences fire risk. Almost all contemporary wildfires in California are caused by human sources such as power lines, car sparks, and electrical equipment. Building new developments in high fire-prone wildlands increases unintentional ignitions and places more people and wildlife in danger. The case study shown here perfectly illustrates the increased risk when developers build in high fire hazard severity zones. Both these fires had similar footprints, but the 1964 Hanley fire caused no deaths and only about 100 structures were destroyed, while the 2017 Tubbs fire killed 22 people and destroyed more than 5,500 structures. This increase in damage can be attributed to the extension of development within the fire footprint after the Hanley fire. Despite a clear link between sprawl development and wildfire risk, local governments continue to approve new construction in high fire-prone wildlands. More than 2 million homes are currently located in high fire risk areas across the state. Los Angeles and San Diego counties were named the top 2 counties in the state with the highest number of housing units located in high wildfire risk areas. And together, these counties and their local governments have recently approved the construction of more than 30,000 homes for almost 100,000 people in high fire prone areas. Okay. If California policymakers continue to expand development into high fire-prone wildlands instead of investing limited public resources in home hardening measures for existing communities, then more destructive fires will ignite and more structures will burn. More people will be killed by fires and have extended exposure to hazardous smoke. More firefighters and first responders will be put at risk. Some biodiversity and unique ecosystems will be lost, and fire suppression and recovery costs will continue to rise. We must change these destructive land policies and prepare our communities to safely coexist with wildfire. Legislation that prevents or limits new development in high wildfire severity hazard zones is needed immediately. This can and should be paired with upzoning urban areas near public transit to provide safe and sustainable solutions to the state's housing crisis. Additionally, we should fund more programs that subsidize the cost of retrofitting existing homes for low-income communities living in high fire risk areas. Measures include investment in distributed solar, external sprinklers, ember-resistant vents, fire-resistant roofs, and irrigated defensible space within 100 feet of structures. Agencies could also work with Native tribes to facilitate cultural burning practices and implement controlled and prescribed fires where appropriate. The science is clear. We need action now to reduce future risk, protect public health, preserve biodiversity, and mitigate the harm experienced by communities most vulnerable. Policymakers need to prioritize public health and the state's biodiversity goals over private developer profits. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. And Michael, founder of Ventura Brush Goats, was not able to make it. So I think we're going to move on into Q&A now. And hopefully we'll hear from Michael maybe on day 3. We'll save the goats for last. And I know I asked each of you to come up with a question for each other, but now that I see we've got a little extra time, I might start with a couple or at least one question for each of you. And let's see, we'll start with Sarah. The 18 Woolsey fire won't soon be forgotten. It burned 100,000 acres and destroyed 1,600 structures. 3 people died. You've given land managers and planners a lot to think about in your presentation. One of your slides included planting of oak trees as buffers as a novel approach. Can you share what resistance received, if any, to this practice, given that sometimes complete clearances what some fire departments and homeowners think is the safest. How do we overcome this suggestion that all vegetation is equally fire prone?
Right, and that's a great question because the Santa Ana winds aren't new, but this is hopefully kind of a newer approach we're taking. So what's really great is we do have these existing relationships, both the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy and MRCA, with landowners and managers. And we do have support for this project from LA County Fire and other folks in the area. I think that there are questions in terms of how we look at planting oak trees as ember resistant barriers, and how we communicate that with with communities and homeowners. So that's definitely a really good question. And I think we'll see how that looks over time, but definitely I think in our region, the large open space managing landowners have that, I believe, consensus of the benefit of planting oak tree buffers.
Great, thank you. And feel free, if anybody wants to jump in and add to any of these answers, you're all welcome to jump in. We do have a question for Allison here, somewhat related. The losses on the campfire are still really hard to grasp. 85 lives lost and 1,800 structures lost. Adding recreational opportunities and multi-benefit approaches to power line fuel breaks might make sense on numerous fronts. What thought is being given to how and who will be responsible for managing these community amenities in the future, these buffers and landscapes? Will HOAs or cities handle this, or special fees have to be levied? And how will fine fuels, invasive grasses and the like be dealt with, especially with new uses in these areas? How will ignitions be minimized? Any thoughts along those lines?
Yeah, so I think, the project we worked on, just kind of broadly traced, how some of these multi-benefit mitigations might work. It leaves, I think, many questions open about how these will be managed, the nuances, and then some of the risks that might be at play and how we might balance all of those things. I will say that, for this project, we were guided by the Parks and Recreation Department in Paradise. And so they were the ones kind of guiding us along as we came up with some of these different ideas. And so I think that's a little bit at play, is, some of these public agencies potentially taking over, long-term management of some of these areas and coming up with the structures to support them in the long term. But yes, I think there's many questions still up in the air about, some of these strategies, who would take them over in the long run.
Great. Thank you. And we have one here for Kelsey. Are there opportunities to identify other invasive species that are lower growing with drone technology, say fountain grass, an abundantly highly flammable invasive species in the Angeles and Santa Monicas? How can this technology help alert land managers of new infestations of invasive species before they get a foothold?
That's a good question. I'm not familiar with that specific species, but if you were to use really high resolution drone imagery in combination with a NDSM or some surface level data that gives you the height of a shrub or tree or grass species above ground, you could potentially identify and separate those from other ground cover and then map those in that specific species.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Peggy, you're next. Your plant palettes are great and will really help support better landscape choices for landscaping and revegetation in the WUI. Can you share how that list might be adaptively managed over time as we learn more about what plants are more successful in those types of settings? And given your recent announcement, congratulations that you'll be taking a position at the Department of Toxic Substances Control. Who will these resources be managed by moving forward?
Those are all good questions. I first want to just briefly touch on that fountain grass question too.
Yeah, please.
We can remotely identify species just by first mapping them in the field, and then we can use the software and the imagery to train the software to identify fountain grass, for example. Sometimes the species is very different from others and it's hard to distinguish them, but if you can train them with field data, it's completely possible. And I would have to say anyone can do it if you give them access to the right computing power. Now for wildland urban interfaces, there was also a question we got for how do we stop people from planting non-natives in these areas when they do defensive kind of species or vegetation control. And I wanted to say that first we have the people who manage our wildland urban interface areas are the fire folks, the fire management folks. And they have a bias against native species. They consider them flammable and dangerous and hazardous. And so I do believe that that specific zone needs to be a negotiation point that we need to zone in as wildland urban interface, and we need to discuss what the management practices and the species that should be planted there should be on a local basis. And so in terms of the plant palettes that the tool generates, what it should be helpful for is for you to have a selection of plant palettes that you can choose from, that in this negotiation process that you can decide on locally which species would be appropriate to plant, and you can go through each species and decide on how to manage that so it's more fire resilient and doesn't contribute to the hazards that the fire department is concerned about. Moving forward in terms of adaptive management, what I've given this some thought, and I realized that not only do we want to plant the species that will do well now, but I think we may need to add the seed bank for what may happen in the future in terms of climate. And that's a moving target as far as we know. And so it may be best to just gather local seed and start adding it back into the landscape while removing invasive species. I hope that answers the question.
Great. Yeah, I think it does. Elizabeth, we have a question here for you. Can the Center for Biodiversity share any example protocols for keeping new development out of fire-prone landscapes? Are hillside ordinances enough? How can we all play a better role at helping cities zone and plan better moving forward?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. The center has been involved with several campaigns, both at the statewide level and then more on the local level, to try to get this into legislation. At this point, I don't see a viable solution statewide. I think we're focusing our concentrations working with local jurisdictions when they're doing general plan updates or housing element updates within their general plan to work in a wildfire ordinance to that says no new development in these hazard zones. We are seeing that electeds and the local agencies are more welcome to this idea than they have been historically, but we really want to make sure that we close all the loopholes. And I think a strong argument that we're really trying to push is that sprawl development is cheap for developers because they don't pay the externalities. It's the taxpayers who are paying for the roads and the infrastructure and the fire stations that have to accommodate that sprawl. And so it really is in the best interest of the community to build infill development around public resources and to also ensure that we have enough funding for communities that already exist in these hazard zones to retrofit to ensure that they are as safe as possible. Another argument that we really like to fight is this idea that that current fire standards will allow us to build fireproof housing. There's no such thing as a fireproof house. We can do a lot to make them fire resistant, and we should for the existing houses, but we can't build new fireproof houses in these zones. And so we should just avoid all new development there.
Great. Thank you. And now I'm hoping that one of you or some of you will take me up on the offer of asking each other a question. We've got about 7 minutes left here. Any brave souls in the group here?
Drew, I had a question for
Good.
Allison and our first speaker, who was, what's our first? Oh, there she is. Sarah.
Yeah.
So we've been talking a lot about plants, but equally important is surface water ecosystems and storage. And I was wondering what your approach is to restoring those post-fire or to protecting them.
Well, I'll jump in. I mean, I think, with our work, we don't necessarily get involved with that, sort of like looking at waterland edges as much, but it is an important, especially to make sure that we don't have, after fire, that we don't have silt and debris moving into those watersheds and moving forward. So it is important to come in very quickly, 6 months afterwards and address those as much as you can.
Yeah, I can jump in real quickly. That's a really good question. And I think a big part in how we're looking at fires, even at a state level, is at a watershed level. And I think that it's important to really look at planning for not fires and watersheds in these isolated worlds, but together. So I think it's important when we have agencies that work in preserving resources that can have a role in both. So I think that's a really good question. And I think it's important to keep that in mind as we move forward.
I could jump in with a question very quickly for Sarah, actually, about the Highway 101 modification project. So I'm guessing that along that corridor, you're dealing with multiple jurisdictions and landowners. I'm just wondering, what does it look like to make all those different players work cooperatively? What is the, how does that easement work? Any info on that would be helpful.
Yeah, great question, Allison. So in the project that we are working on right now, I showed you a map earlier with where we're planting the trees. We actually own and manage all those lands. So we're able to complete that work with our restoration crews and with the workforce development crews we already work with. We regularly plant trees in terms of restoration and various projects. We actually grow a lot of those trees ourselves from acorns. But what's really great is it's really with funding, we can expand those projects. And it's relatively easy in terms of, because we own that land. But I do hope that it is a demonstration for other landowners in the area to kind of expand on projects such as that. Great question, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We have time for a couple more. Happy to end early, but I would urge anyone here with an itch to share their question.
I actually have a question for Allison. So for looking at trails, as that's one of the things that we do and at the MRCA, and I'm interested in looking at trails not as fuel breaks, but when we're looking at trails that are in the process of being planned or developed, how we can help incorporate those trails as access to fire response. And if you have any, if you can speak to that a little bit more, or if you have any examples that demonstrate that, I find it interesting to look at the trails as multi-benefit and perhaps to help create access for firefighters and other folks.
Yeah, Yeah, so we deal with some projects that kind of run into issues like that, and we definitely, I think increasingly in our work, this idea of multi-benefit becomes very important, that we're not just designing one singular element, but we're looking at how many other things we can add on that are of benefit to whatever project we're working on. So I think your point is very important, and we have approached it on different projects in that way, looking at different trail systems and how they could be multifunctional as fire breaks or as access, to different parts of the site, or as ways to even bring people into different parts of the site where they can be gain a greater awareness of what's going on in some of these different areas and understand, how the landscape is functioning. So definitely, it's important to not, with any built element, and not sparse them out across the site, but think about how to limit impact onto the landscape and think about multi-benefit corridors.
Thank you, Allison. Great question, Sarah. Any last chance here, folks? Any others?
Drew, I realized I didn't answer your question about who's going to pick up the baton.
Yeah, thank you.
And on my last day, I gave a policy recommendations webinar. It should be posted on the biodiversity webpage of the city eventually, but basically what I recommended is moving forward that the city forms a working group to develop a long-term a biodiversity strategy and action plan for the city that kind of mirrors the format that countries are using around the world. And so I would hope that we would see many of you on such a working group. And if you would like the work to move forward, I would contact Andy Schrader at Council District 5. I left it with the recommendation that the work should continue with the Mayor's Office of International Affairs, City Planning Department, and I've transitioned a lot of this to them. The plant palette tool is going to hopefully become part of ZEMIS and a web portal that's going to